After my son said I was not invited to Christmas, I simply got in my truck and drove away. 3 days passed, and then I received 40 missed calls. I am Warren Gallagher, 71 years old, and for 4 years I silently paid the $4,200 monthly mortgage on the sprawling suburban property where my son Russell and his wife Tessa live. I lived in a modest one-bedroom apartment just to ensure I could maintain this support. But that Christmas Eve, standing on their freezing porch, I realized I was not a father to them. I was an automated clearinghouse. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I spent 40 years as a structural engineer building municipal bridges across the state. I know exactly how much weight a foundation can hold before it cracks. I know the precise mathematical moment when a supporting beam will buckle under a sustained, unyielding load. Human relationships are not so different from bridges. They require maintenance balance and a mutual distribution of weight. For the last 4 years, I had been carrying the entire load for my son Russell, and the foundation was beginning to scream. When my wife passed away 5 years ago, the silence in our old family home became deafening. The empty hallways echoed with memories that were too heavy to carry alone. Russell had just married Tessa, a woman whose ambitions vastly exceeded her income. They were living in a cramped rental, drowning in wedding debt, and complaining endlessly about their lack of space. They wanted a house. Not just any house, but a 4-bedroom colonial in a gated subdivision with manicured lawns and a neighborhood association. They did not have the credit. They did not have the down payment. They had nothing but demands and expectations. I made a decision that many grieving fathers make. I chose to buy their happiness. I purchased the house outright through a limited liability company I controlled, intending to protect the asset. I told Russell and Tessa that I had co-signed a specialized mortgage for them, and that I would cover the $4,200 monthly payment out of my retirement funds to help them get on their feet. I told them this was a temporary measure, a crutch to lean on until Russell earned his promotion. To afford this without touching my primary investment portfolio, I sold the family home and moved into a tight, drafty one-bedroom apartment above a commercial dry cleaner. My mornings were narrated by the hiss of industrial steam presses and the clatter of delivery trucks. My kitchen was barely large enough for a single table. My wardrobe consisted of faded flannel shirts, durable denim, and work boots that had seen better decades. I lived like a man who was barely scraping by. I did this deliberately. I wanted to see if the boy I raised would value my presence when I appeared to have nothing left to give but my company. The answer was a slow, agonizing revelation. The calls from Russell became strictly transactional. My phone would ring on a Tuesday afternoon, and my heart would briefly lift, hoping my son was calling to ask about my week, or perhaps invite me for coffee. Instead, the conversations were surgical and hollow. Dad Leo needs private geometry tutoring this semester, and it is $800. Can you handle that? Dad, Tessa wants to upgrade the landscaping before the neighborhood block party. We need another $1,000. Dad, the property taxes are due. You are handling that right. There was no warmth. There was no inquiry about my arthritis, which flared up when the winter damp seeped into my apartment walls. There were only invoices delivered by a familiar voice. I paid them. I paid every single one. I was running a stress test on my own family, watching the load-bearing walls of our relationship warp and splinter under the weight of their entitlement. Tessa was worse. When I did visit, which was rarely and always scheduled weeks in advance, she treated my presence like a scheduled maintenance inspection. She would look at my scuffed boots on her pristine hardwood floors with undisguised disgust. She would hand me a coaster before I even sat down. The breaking point did not arrive with a scream or a violent argument. It arrived quietly on a freezing evening in late December. It was 6 o'clock on Christmas Eve. The temperature had plummeted to 14 degrees, and a bitter slicing wind was whipping sleet across the suburban streets. I had spent the entire week in my tiny apartment kitchen preparing for this night. I had roasted a prime heritage ham basting it for hours until it was perfect. More importantly, I had spent the last 2 months in the small corner of my living room that I used as a workshop, hand-carving a custom wooden train set for my grandson Leo. I had sanded every edge, painted every car by hand, and assembled a sprawling track that I knew would light up his eyes. I wrapped the gifts, carefully loaded them into my battered pickup truck, and drove 45 minutes across town through the worsening storm. The houses in Russell's subdivision were glowing with festive lights. Laughter and warm music drifted from the windows of their neighbors. I parked at the end of their long driveway, shivering as I gathered the heavy ham and the large wrapped box containing the train set. I walked up the salted pathway to their grand front door. I could see the glow of a fire through the frosted glass. I could hear the clinking of wine glasses and the low hum of elegant conversation. I rang the doorbell, my breath pluming in the freezing air, my fingers numb despite my gloves. I waited. The music inside suddenly dipped in volume. Footsteps approached the door. The heavy oak door opened, but only a fraction, just enough for Tessa to block the threshold. She was wearing a tailored silk dress, a string of pearls resting against her collarbone. The warm, cinnamon-scented air from the house washed over my freezing face. She looked at me, her eyes darting down to my faded flannel jacket, my snow-covered boots, and the aluminum foil wrapping the roasting pan in my hands. Her expression twisted into a sharp, panicked grimace. "Warren, what are you doing here?" she hissed, keeping her voice low so the guests inside could not hear. I smiled, though the cold was biting at my face. "I brought the ham, Tessa, and I have Leo's gift. I thought I would bring them by tonight, so they are here for tomorrow." Tessa did not open the door any wider. She gripped the edge of the wood, her knuckles turning white. "Warren, tonight is my corporate holiday mixer. The senior partners from my firm are in the living room. We are having a catered formal evening." Before I could process the absolute lack of an invitation to come inside out of the freezing sleet, Russell appeared behind her. He placed a hand on his wife's shoulder, peering through the crack in the door. He was wearing a tailored blazer and holding a crystal tumbler of scotch. The scotch I had bought him for his birthday. "Dad, what are you doing?" Russell asked, his tone laced with heavy, impatient annoyance. "We discussed this. Tonight is for Tessa's colleagues." I looked at my son, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the boy whose college tuition I had paid in full, the man whose very roof was kept over his head by my daily sacrifices. "I just came to drop off the food for tomorrow," I said quietly, "and to give Leo his gift." Russell sighed, a sharp, exasperated sound that cut through the winter wind. "Dad, you do not really fit the aesthetic we are going for tonight. My partners cannot see you looking like a lumberjack on our porch. Just leave the food and the box on the mat. We will bring it in when the caterers clear out." I stared at him. The sleet was beginning to accumulate on my shoulders. I felt the heavy roasting pan burning through the foil into my numb hands. "Leave it on the mat. Like a delivery driver. Like a hired servant." And about tomorrow, Russell continued shifting his weight uncomfortably, but not opening the door an inch wider. We actually decided to do an intimate morning, just the three of us. Tessa is exhausted from the firm, and we just need our space. You are not invited to the actual Christmas dinner either. Her parents are flying in, and it is going to be a tight house. We will call you next week to catch up. The silence that fell between us was heavier than the winter storm. I looked into my son's eyes. I searched for a flicker of shame, a momentary lapse of conscience, a shadow of the boy who used to beg me to read him stories by the fire. There was nothing. There was only the cold, calculating gaze of a man who had extracted all the utility he needed from a machine and was now powering it down for the holidays. "You are not invited. We need our space. Leave the gifts on the mat." In engineering, when a structure reaches its ultimate tensile strength, the failure is not gradual. It is catastrophic and instantaneous. The bonds snap. The supports shear. The entire edifice collapses into a pile of twisted wreckage. Standing on that porch, the illusion of my family suffered a catastrophic failure. I did not yell. I did not demand to see my grandson. I did not hurl the roasted ham onto their pristine porch. Rage is an uncontrolled release of energy. I am an engineer. I control energy. I redirect it. I looked at Russell. I looked at Tessa. I nodded slowly. I understand, I said. My voice was perfectly flat, completely devoid of the fatherly warmth they had exploited for years. I bent down. I placed the heavy, meticulously carved wooden train set on the freezing wet welcome mat. I placed the warm roasting pan right beside it. I stood back up, looking at my son one last time. Merry Christmas, Russell. I turned my back on them and walked down the pathway. I heard the heavy oak door click shut and the deadbolt lock before I even reached my truck. I climbed into the freezing cabin of my pickup. I did not turn on the heater. I sat in the absolute biting cold, letting the physical discomfort anchor my mind. The betrayal was a physical weight in my chest, a suffocating pressure that demanded to be released. But I would not release it in tears. I started the engine and drove away from the glowing subdivision, navigating the slick, icy roads with mechanical precision. I drove for 3 miles until I saw the flickering fluorescent lights of a desolate gas station. I pulled into the empty lot and parked by the air pump. The snow was falling harder now, coating the windshield in a thick layer of white. The isolation was absolute. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. My fingers were stiff, but my mind had never been clearer. I opened my banking application. The blue screen illuminated the dark cabin. I navigated past the meager checking account that I used for my daily groceries. I scrolled down to the automated transfers section. There it was. The lifeline. The invisible cord that pumped my lifeblood into their arrogant veins. Scheduled transfer. $4,200. Recipient Russell Gallagher Mortgage Escrow. Scheduled date December 26th. For 4 years, that transfer had executed flawlessly. It was the foundation of their entire existence. It paid for the roof over the catered party they were hosting. It paid for the doors they had just locked in my face. It was the money that allowed Tessa to wear silk and pearls while I wore faded flannel. I stared at the screen. The cancel button rested at the bottom, outlined in red. They did not want me to fit their aesthetic. They needed their space. They viewed me as an outdated relic, a burdensome fixture that could be left on the welcome mat in the freezing rain. They believed they held all the power because they held my grandson and my affection hostage. They had forgotten a fundamental rule of structural mechanics. The entity that provides the support controls the collapse. I pressed my frozen thumb against the screen. I tapped the red button. A confirmation prompt appeared. Are you sure you want to permanently cancel this recurring transfer? Yes. The screen refreshed. The transfer vanished. The money remained in my account. The cord was severed. I exhaled, my breath clouding the cold air of the cabin. The tension in my chest did not evaporate, but it crystallized. It hardened into a weapon. I put the phone in the cup holder and shifted the truck into gear. As I pulled out of the gas station and merged onto the dark highway, heading back to my cramped apartment, the silence inside the truck was suddenly shattered. The phone in the cup holder began to vibrate violently against the plastic. The screen lit up, flashing a name. Russell. It was 6:45. He had probably just received the automated email alert from the bank regarding the canceled pending transaction. The bank's algorithms were ruthless and immediate. The phone kept buzzing. It danced across the console, a frantic, desperate rhythm. I did not reach for it. I kept my hands on the steering wheel, my eyes fixed on the snowy road ahead. I let it ring. I listened to the sound of his panic echoing in the small cabin. The phone stopped. A second later, it started again, ringing, vibrating, demanding my attention. I reached down and picked it up. I pressed the green button to accept the call. I held the phone to my ear, but I did not speak a single word. I simply listened to the cold, dead air. Dad Russell's voice barked through the speaker. He was no longer whispering. He had stepped away from the corporate mixer. The background was quiet. He was probably standing in the garage, hiding from his guests. "Dad, are you there? Listen. I just got a weird automated alert from the bank. It says the escrow transfer for the 26th was canceled. You need to call their customer service line right now and fix the tech glitch. The grace period ends on the 1st, and we cannot have a late fee hitting our credit report. Call them and fix it." He did not ask if I had made it home safely in the ice. He did not apologize for leaving me on the porch. He issued a command to the machine he expected to dispense his money. I listened to his breathing through the speaker. I listened to the arrogant assumption that I was simply a malfunctioning piece of hardware in his perfect life. "Dad, are you listening to me? Call the bank." All. I lowered the phone from my ear. I pressed the red button, cutting the connection. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat and turned on the radio, letting the static hum of a late-night broadcast fill the truck. The first domino had fallen. The foundation had been removed. And as I drove back to my tiny apartment above the dry cleaner, I knew with absolute terrifying certainty that the audit of their entire lives was about to begin. The morning after Christmas brought a bitter chill, but I felt nothing as I walked through the glass doors of the First National Bank. The holiday music playing softly from the overhead speakers felt like a mockery of the reality I was about to dismantle. I did not come here to seek comfort or to dwell on the image of my son locking me out in the freezing rain. I came here to inspect the blueprints of a collapsing structure. As an engineer, when a load-bearing wall shows a hairline fracture, you do not just patch the paint. You tear away the drywall and inspect the entire foundation. I walked directly to the teller and requested a meeting with the branch manager. The manager, a younger man named Mitchell, recognized me immediately. I was not a wealthy man in appearance, wearing my usual faded denim and a simple wool coat. But Mitchell knew the balance of the limited liability company accounts I held in their vault. He ushered me into his glass-walled office. I asked him to pull up every single financial record attached to my Social Security number. I told him I needed to verify the cancellation of the $4,200 automated transfer I had executed from my truck the night before. Mitchell typed at his keyboard for a few moments. He nodded, confirming the transfer to Russell's mortgage escrow had been permanently revoked. The funds were secure in my primary holding account. That should have been the end of the meeting. The bleeding of my retirement was stopped. But my engineering instincts hummed with a dark, persistent frequency. The disrespect I had suffered on that porch was too profound, too absolute to be the result of mere entitlement. It was the arrogance of a man who believed he held total, untouchable control over his source of income. I asked Mitchell to run a complete audit of all auxiliary accounts. The printer in the corner of the office began to hum. Mitchell gathered a stack of papers and laid them on the desk. He looked at the top sheet, his brow furrowing in mild confusion. He slid the paper across the polished wood toward me. He asked if I wanted to review the activity on the joint emergency checking account. I stared at the black ink on the white paper. The numbers blurred for a fraction of a second as a ghost from my past entered the room. 10 years ago, when my wife was diagnosed with aggressive pancreatic cancer, our lives dissolved into a chaotic blur of hospital stays and hospice care. I had opened this specific high-yield checking account to manage the overwhelming flood of medical expenses. I needed a dedicated reservoir of funds to ensure her final days were comfortable. Because I was spending days and nights terrified that the stress would cause me to have a medical emergency of my own, I added Russell as a secondary signer to the account. I explicitly told him this was a fail-safe, a glass to be broken only if I was incapacitated. My wife passed away 5 years ago. I had not touched that account since the day I paid her final funeral expenses. I had left the remaining balance, roughly $80,000, sitting in the account to gather interest, a silent monument to the worst year of my life. I looked down at the paper Mitchell had handed me. The current balance was not $80,000. It was barely $14,000. A cold, mechanical precision washed over me. I did not gasp. I simply asked Mitchell to print the itemized withdrawal history for the past 24 months. The printer whirred to life again, churning out transaction logs. I picked up the stack and began to read. I read them with the same detached scrutiny I used to evaluate failed steel cables on a collapsed suspension bridge. The pattern was rhythmic, consistent, predatory. On the third day of every single month, exactly $1,500 had been transferred out of the medical emergency fund. I tracked the routing numbers. The destination was not a hospital. It was not a pharmacy. The money was being funneled directly into a secondary checking account owned solely by Russell and Tessa. I asked Mitchell to pull the destination details for those specific funds. Because the transfers were internal between linked accounts, he had the clearance to see where the money eventually landed. He typed rapidly, his face growing pale as he realized what he was showing me. The money meant for a dying woman's care was being systematically harvested to pay for elite memberships. $700 a month was being routed to the Oakbridge Country Club for their exclusive couples membership. $800 a month was being automatically drafted to a luxury auto leasing corporation in the city. Russell and Tessa were driving two imported silver sport utility vehicles, parading their success around their gated subdivision, completely financed by the money I had set aside to keep his mother out of pain. I sat in the quiet office, the hum of the air conditioning, the only sound in the room. The betrayal underwent a radical shift in my mind. The disrespect on the porch the night before was emotional cruelty. But this was systemic, calculated theft. Russell had not just locked me out of his Christmas party. He had been quietly siphoning my life savings while smiling to my face, treating my grief as his personal slush fund. He viewed me not as a father, but as a host organism to be drained until there was nothing left. Mitchell cleared his throat nervously. He asked if I wanted to dispute the charges. He reminded me that because Russell was a legal signer on the account, the bank considered these authorized withdrawals. From a purely administrative standpoint, Russell had the right to move those funds. The bank could not prosecute him for spending money he technically had access to, regardless of the moral depravity of his actions. I placed the papers back on the desk. I did not want to dispute the charges with a customer service representative. I wanted to sever the parasite entirely. I instructed Mitchell to immediately freeze the account. I ordered a total lockdown on every single financial product attached to my name, requiring my physical presence and a government-issued identification for any future movement of funds. I watched him input the security protocols, verifying that Russell's digital access was permanently terminated. As Mitchell finished locking down the profiles, he clicked on a separate tab on his monitor. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the mouse. He looked at me with a profound, sudden pity that made my jaw clench. He asked me if I was aware of the recent credit activity tied to the emergency medical account. I told him I had not opened a line of credit in over a decade. Mitchell turned the monitor completely around so I could see the screen. 3 months ago, a massive line of credit had been attached to the joint checking account. It was an unsecured loan for $45,000, utilizing the remaining cash balance as a baseline for approval. The loan had been maxed out within 2 weeks of its creation. The funds had been transferred directly to a high-end home remodeling contractor in the city. Tessa had wanted new landscaping and a complete renovation of her outdoor entertaining space for her corporate mixers. I stared at the digital signature on the application form displayed on the screen. The bank required the primary account holder to authorize any credit extensions of this magnitude. My name was signed at the bottom of the digital document. I leaned closer to the monitor. I am an engineer. I have spent my entire life drafting precise blueprints and signing off on strict architectural schematics. My signature is a rigid, calculated sequence of sharp angles and exact proportions. The signature on the screen was a sloppy, hurried imitation. The loops were too wide. The pressure was inconsistent. It was the signature of a desperate man trying to replicate a masterpiece with a broken pen. Russell had forged my signature. The scope of the conflict instantly escalated, shattering the boundaries of a mere family dispute. Withdrawing funds from a joint account was a civil gray area, a moral failing that the police would ignore. But forging a signature on a federally insured credit application to secure $45,000 was entirely different. It was a felony. It was wire fraud, identity theft, and financial elder abuse. I asked Mitchell to print the fraudulent credit application, complete with the forged digital signature, and to stamp it with the bank's official seal of verification. I did not explain my intentions. I simply collected the thick stack of printed evidence, folded it neatly, and slid it into the inner pocket of my wool coat. I stood up and thanked Mitchell for his time. He told me he was deeply sorry for the situation, offering to connect me with the bank's fraud department. I declined. I told him the fraud department would only slow me down. I walked out of the bank and stepped back into the freezing December morning. The sky was a pale, unbroken gray, offering no warmth. I climbed into my truck, the engine roaring to life as I turned the ignition. I did not drive back to my cramped apartment. I did not call Russell to demand an explanation or to scream about his betrayal. Shouting would only give him time to prepare a defense, time to craft a lie, time to hide his assets. Instead, I pulled into traffic and headed toward the downtown business district. I was driving to the office of a man who did not deal in emotions or family counseling. I was going to see a man who specialized in the absolute destruction of financial liabilities. The theft had provided me with the exact blueprint I needed to demolish the arrogant, entitled world my son had built on my back. The warning signs had been ignored, the structural integrity was compromised, and I was about to trigger the controlled demolition. My phone remained completely silent on the passenger seat. Russell did not know the emergency account was frozen yet. He did not know the credit line was flagged. He was entirely unaware that the foundation of his pristine suburban life was already crumbling beneath his feet. I pressed my foot against the accelerator, the engine humming with a steady, lethal purpose as I drove toward the lawyer's office. The time for silent observation was over. The time for the audit was complete. It was time to hand them the bill. I parked 2 blocks away from a towering glass high-rise. The building housed the most ruthless corporate litigation firm in the state. I walked through the revolving doors, my snow-covered boots squeaking against the polished marble floor. The receptionist at the front desk looked at my faded flannel coat with polite disdain. She asked if I was lost. I told her I was there to see Grant. Grant was not a family lawyer. He did not handle messy divorces or emotional custody battles. He dismantled corporations. He liquidated hostile assets. He was a predator in a tailored suit, and he owed my late wife his entire career. 30 years ago, she had paid his law school tuition when he was a brilliant but penniless kid from our neighborhood. He never forgot the debt. When he walked into the lobby and saw me standing there, he bypassed the receptionist entirely and embraced me. He guided me past a maze of glass-walled conference rooms and into his private corner office overlooking the frozen city. He poured 2 glasses of bourbon, sliding one across his massive mahogany desk. He looked at my worn clothes and shook his head. He asked how long I was going to keep up this charade. He asked when I was finally going to stop living like a pauper and touch the money. I picked up the glass, feeling the warmth of the amber liquid against my frozen palms. I took a slow sip. I told him the charade was officially over. I told him the stress test had yielded catastrophic results. Grant leaned back in his leather chair. He knew exactly what I was talking about. He was the only person alive who knew the truth about my financial reality. When my wife passed away 5 years ago, she did not just leave me with a quiet, empty house. We had spent decades making incredibly aggressive, highly lucrative investments in commercial real estate and emerging technology sectors. We never touched the principal. We lived on my engineering salary and let the investments compound in the shadows. By the time she died, those offshore accounts held $2,200,000 in liquid capital. I never told Russell. I never told Tessa. When they complained about their wedding debt, I pretended to drain my modest retirement fund to buy their house through a blind, limited liability company. I moved into a miserable apartment above a dry cleaner and wore the same 3 pairs of jeans for 5 years. I wanted to see who my son truly was. I wanted to know if he would visit a father who had nothing left to offer but his time. I needed to see if his love was unconditional or if it was entirely dependent on a steady stream of subsidies. I explained this all to Grant as the snow hammered against his office window. I told him how they left me standing on their freezing porch on Christmas Eve because my clothes did not match their aesthetic. I told him how they restricted my access to my grandson. I told him how I had finally canceled the automated mortgage payment that morning. Grant listened in absolute silence. His predatory instincts were already calculating the fallout. He asked what else I had done. I reached into the inner pocket of my coat and pulled out the thick stack of papers the bank teller had printed for me. I placed them flat on his desk. I told him I audited the joint emergency checking account we had opened 10 years ago for my wife's hospice care. I watched Grant put on his reading glasses and lean over the documents. The silence in the room deepened as he traced his finger down the itemized transaction logs. He saw the pattern immediately. He saw the steady parasitic drain of $1,500 every single month. He saw the routing numbers leading directly to the luxury car leases and the exclusive country club memberships. His expression hardened into a mask of professional disgust. He looked up at me and confirmed what the bank had already said. Grant explained that from a civil standpoint, this was a nightmare to prosecute, because I had authorized Russell as a secondary signer on the account. During my wife's illness, Russell technically had the administrative right to move those funds. Grant warned me that if we took this to civil court, a judge might view it as a generous father voluntarily subsidizing his son's lifestyle. The law rarely cares about the moral depravity of a son stealing a dying mother's medical funds to pay for golf lessons. Civil court would drag on for years, draining my energy and resulting in a pathetic slap on the wrist. I did not interrupt him. I waited patiently. I knew what was coming next in that stack of papers. Grant turned the page. He stopped speaking. The air in the room seemed to freeze. He was looking at the final document in the file, the unsecured credit line application for $45,000. He read the destination of the funds, a high-end landscaping and renovation firm. He looked at the date the account was opened, 3 months prior. Then his eyes drifted down to the digital signature line at the very bottom of the page. He studied the erratic, sloppy loops of ink that claimed to be my name. He knew my handwriting. He had seen my signature on dozens of pristine architectural blueprints and legal trusts over the years. Grant took his glasses off and placed them slowly on the desk. He looked at me, his voice dropping an octave. He asked me directly if I had authorized that credit extension. He asked if I had signed that piece of paper. I looked him dead in the eye. I told him I had not touched that account in 5 years. I told him my son had fabricated the signature to secure $45,000 to build a patio for his wife's corporate mixers. A slow, dangerous smile spread across Grant's face. The dynamic in the room shifted instantly. We were no longer discussing a sad, neglected father trying to reclaim stolen grocery money. We were looking at a loaded weapon. Grant leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the mahogany desk. He explained exactly what we were holding. He said this was no longer a messy family dispute over joint funds. This was a direct violation of federal law. Russell had used a digitally transmitted document across state banking lines to secure funds under false pretenses. He had committed aggravated identity theft. He had committed financial elder abuse. Most importantly, he had committed federal wire fraud. Grant detailed the mechanics of the trap we were about to build. He explained that a civil lawsuit would only make them hire a defense attorney and hide their assets. We needed to let the trap snap shut entirely on its own. We needed to push them into a corner where their arrogance would force them to make a fatal mistake. I asked him what our first maneuver should be. Grant told me to do absolutely nothing. He instructed me to go back to my tiny apartment and let the silence fester. The mortgage payment had bounced. The automated alerts were already hitting Russell's phone. When Russell tried to log into the emergency medical account to transfer funds and cover his deficit, he would find the account completely frozen by the bank's fraud department. The panic would set in. Russell and Tessa were drowning in a lifestyle they could not afford. They leased imported cars. They paid exorbitant club dues. They were living month to month on my secret charity. Once the money stopped flowing, their entire ecosystem would collapse in a matter of days. Grant promised me that desperation breeds stupidity. They would come looking for me. They would demand the money. And when they did, they would try to use intimidation to force my hand. Grant stood up and walked over to a secure filing cabinet. He pulled out a fresh stack of legal paper. He told me it was time to prepare the heavy artillery. Since my limited liability company owned the house outright, and Russell was merely a guest paying rent masquerading as a mortgage, we had absolute authority over the property. Grant began drafting a formal immediate 30-day notice to vacate the premises. He explained that we would not mail the notice. We would not send it through certified courier. We would wait for them to come to me. We would let them scream and threaten and show their true colors. And when they reached the peak of their entitlement, we would hand them the eviction notice in person. I finished my bourbon. The liquid burned a slow, steady path down my throat. The betrayal was complete, but the grief had entirely evaporated. My son had looked at me standing in the freezing rain and decided I was nothing more than an ugly aesthetic that needed to be hidden from his guests. He had looked at the money set aside for his mother's final days and decided it belonged to his country club. He had forged my name to build a patio. I told Grant to draw up the papers. I told him to make sure there were 0 loopholes, 0 grace periods, and 0 room for negotiation. Grant nodded. He promised me that by the time we were finished, Russell and Tessa would be stripped of every luxury they had stolen. They would lose the house. They would lose the cars. And if they pushed hard enough, they would lose their freedom. I shook his hand, buttoned my faded flannel coat, and walked out of the corner office. I rode the elevator down to the lobby and stepped back out into the blizzard. The snow was piling up on the sidewalks, burying the city under a blanket of white. I climbed into my truck and drove back to my cramped, noisy apartment above the dry cleaner. My phone remained completely silent on the passenger seat. I knew Russell had stopped calling. I knew he was currently staring at his banking application, realizing the accounts were locked. I knew the panic was spreading through his chest. I parked my truck, walked up the narrow stairs to my apartment, and sat in the dark. I did not turn on the television. I did not turn on the lights. I simply sat in the shadows and waited for the desperate strike to begin. The trap was armed. The bait was set. The legal blade was sharpened and waiting to fall. The drive back from the law firm was a blur of gray slush and crawling traffic. When I finally parked my truck behind the brick building, the familiar hum of the dry cleaning machines below my apartment greeted me. I climbed the narrow wooden stairs. My knees ached from the winter cold, but my mind was operating with a frictionless clarity. I unlocked my door and stepped into the cramped living space. For 5 years, I had lived in this small box, pretending to be a man stripped of his resources, just to gauge the character of my only son. The experiment was over. The results were conclusive. I took off my damp wool coat and laid the thick stack of bank documents flat on my small kitchen table. I am an engineer by trade and by nature. When a structure fails, you do not panic. You isolate the stress points, you calculate the total structural load, and you initiate a controlled demolition. I walked to the kitchen drawer and pulled out a fresh legal pad and a drafting pen. I sat down at the table and began to map out my son's absolute ruin. The first phase required total surveillance. Russell had always possessed a volatile temper. I remembered a summer evening 20 years ago when he was cut from his high school baseball team. He came home and threw a baseball bat through the glass pane of our garage door. He lacked emotional regulation when denied something he felt he deserved. Now I was about to deny him his entire lifestyle. I knew the moment the bank froze his access to the stolen funds, his panic would inevitably turn into physical aggression. I needed every second of his reaction documented. I left my apartment and drove to an electronics supply store on the edge of town. I purchased 4 high-definition wireless surveillance cameras with cloud storage capabilities. I drove back home and spent the next 2 hours installing them. I mounted the first camera directly above my front door, angling the lens to capture the entire narrow hallway. If Russell came to intimidate me, his face and his threats would be broadcast directly to a remote server. I placed a second camera inside my living room, hidden discreetly behind a row of hardcover books on a high shelf. It provided a clear, unobstructed view of the kitchen table and the entryway. I called Grant from my prepaid mobile phone. I told him I needed to wire his office for audio and video recording before the end of the day. Grant agreed immediately. He understood the legal necessity of catching a desperate man in a lie. I drove back downtown and spent an hour in his law firm. We mounted a discreet lens in the lobby to capture the arrival of any hostile guests. We placed another camera inside his mahogany corner office, perfectly positioned to record anyone sitting in the client chairs. We linked all 4 video feeds to a secure application on my phone. I stood in Grant's office testing the audio feed. The clarity was terrifying. Every footstep, every rustle of paper, every spoken threat would be preserved with crystalline perfection. We were ready for the siege. I returned to my apartment as the winter sun began to set. The streetlights flickered to life outside my window, casting long shadows across the floor. It was time to execute the legal dismantling of Russell's pristine suburban life. I opened my heavy metal lockbox and retrieved the original incorporation documents for the limited liability company I had created 4 years ago. When I bought the 4-bedroom colonial house for Russell and Tessa, I intentionally layered the purchase through a corporate entity registered in Delaware. I did this to shield my wealth from public records, but it also granted me absolute unyielding control over the asset. Russell and Tessa believed I had simply co-signed a traditional mortgage. They believed their names were on the deed alongside mine. They were entirely wrong. I smoothed the heavy parchment on the table. The documents proved that my corporate entity was the sole legal owner of the property. Russell and Tessa were legally classified as month-to-month tenants. The $4,200 payment they demanded I make every month was never a mortgage payment. It was a rent transfer. And because I had just canceled that transfer, they were officially in default. I uncapped my drafting pen and began to write. I drafted a formal corporate resolution dissolving the current tenancy agreement due to non-payment. I outlined the exact statutes that allowed for an immediate termination of their occupancy. My handwriting flowed across the page with sharp, deliberate precision. I compared my rigid signatures on the corporate filings to the sloppy, hurried forgery Russell had submitted to the bank for his $45,000 credit line. The contrast was the difference between a master builder and a careless thief. I prepared the formal 30-day notice to vacate the premises. I did not soften the language. I did not offer a grace period or a chance to negotiate arrears. I stated clearly that the occupants had defaulted on their financial obligations and were required to surrender all keys and vacate the property by the end of the upcoming month. Failure to comply would result in immediate physical eviction by the county sheriff's department. I placed the signed eviction notice inside a thick manila envelope. I added a certified copy of the original deed, proving they held zero equity in the home. Finally, I included a printed summary of the joint medical account showing the steady parasitic drain of $1,500 a month. I wanted them to see the exact mechanism of their downfall. I wanted them to know that I had tracked every single dollar they had stolen from my dead wife's hospice fund to pay for their country club dues. I sealed the envelope and placed it in the center of the kitchen table. It sat there like an unexploded bomb. The transformation was complete. The grieving father who had stood shivering on a snowy porch 24 hours earlier was gone. He had died the moment his son told him to leave the Christmas gifts on the wet welcome mat, like a hired servant. In his place sat a structural engineer who had just removed the foundational pillars of a corrupt building. I walked over to the small kitchenette and poured myself a glass of tap water. I stood by the window and looked out at the frozen street below. The snow was falling in heavy, silent drifts. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened the security application. The screen split into 4 distinct grids. I saw the empty hallway outside my apartment door. I saw the quiet interior of my own living room. I saw the dark, elegant lobby of Grant's law firm. I saw the empty leather chairs in his corner office. The stage was perfectly set. Every angle was covered. Every legal document was signed and sealed. The offshore accounts were fortified and hidden safely behind layers of encrypted security. Russell and Tessa had spent years treating me like a mindless utility, an automated clearinghouse that required no maintenance and deserved no respect. They had assumed my silence was a symptom of weakness and senility. They had vastly underestimated the terrifying patience of a man who builds things to last. I knew the timeline of their panic. The holiday weekend was ending. Tomorrow morning, the automated banking systems would resume their standard processing. The cancellation of the massive rent transfer would trigger a cascade of alerts. When Russell attempted to log into his portal to verify the funds, he would find the digital gates locked. When he attempted to access the medical emergency fund to cover his shortfall, he would trigger the fraud flags I had established with the bank manager. Their pristine, arrogant ecosystem was about to suffer a total systemic failure. They would not be able to pay their luxury vehicle leases. They would not be able to cover their neighborhood association fees. The carefully constructed facade of their success would shatter in front of all their prestigious colleagues. I placed my phone next to the manila envelope on the table. I sat down in the wooden chair and waited in the silence. I did not feel anger. I felt an absolute chilling equilibrium. The load-bearing walls of their deception were buckling. The collapse was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitable mathematical certainty. I watched the digital clock on my phone tick forward minute by minute, knowing that the 40 missed calls were only a few hours away. I folded my hands on the table and let the silence wash over me. The architect was ready. The demolition had begun. January 1st arrived with a brutal and unforgiving frost that coated the windows of my apartment in a thick layer of ice. The city below was completely silent. The dry cleaning business on the ground floor was closed for the holiday, and the usual rumble of delivery trucks was absent from the empty streets. I woke up exactly at 6 in the morning, as I always did. I did not need an alarm clock. My internal rhythm had been set by 40 years of arriving at construction sites before the sun came up. I walked into my cramped kitchen and filled the coffee pot with water. The linoleum floor was cold against my bare feet. I pressed the power button on the machine and watched the black liquid drip slowly into the glass carafe. I sat at my small wooden table and looked at my smartphone resting on the surface. The digital clock displayed 6:30. Midnight had passed 6.5 hours ago. In the sterile, air-conditioned server rooms of the First National Bank, a sequence of automated scripts had executed their daily protocols. Algorithms had scanned the vast network of accounts looking for scheduled directives. For 4 years, those algorithms had located my primary holding account, extracted $4,200, and routed it directly into the escrow account attached to my son's suburban property. But last night, the algorithms found nothing. The standing order had been permanently erased. The digital pathway had been severed. I knew exactly how the banking system operated. When a high-value automated transfer fails to execute on the first of the month, the system does not wait. It generates an immediate deficiency notice. It compiles an automated email and dispatches it to the primary contact on file. Russell would have received that email in the early hours of the morning, while he was still sleeping off the excesses of his New Year's Eve party. I poured my coffee and wrapped my hands around the warm ceramic mug. I did not have to wait long. At exactly 9:15 in the morning, the phone resting on my table began to vibrate. The sudden noise was harsh and abrasive in the quiet apartment. The screen illuminated the dim kitchen, flashing the name Russell in bright white letters. I did not reach for the device. I sat perfectly still and took a slow sip of my black coffee. I watched the phone vibrate against the wood until the call automatically diverted to voicemail. A small notification icon appeared on the screen. A moment later, the phone began to vibrate again. And then again. I simply watched it. I was conducting a structural stress test on my son's psychological endurance. I needed to document the exact rate at which his entitlement degraded into absolute terror. After the 5th consecutive missed call, I tapped the screen and opened the voicemail application. I pressed play on the first message and let the audio fill the kitchen. Dad, pick up the phone. Russell's voice was thick with sleep and heavy irritation. I just woke up and saw a stupid email from the bank. It says the escrow transfer bounced or got canceled or something. Tessa is extremely annoyed because she has a spa appointment this morning, and this is stressing her out. Call the bank and fix whatever technical glitch you caused. Let me know when it is done. The message ended with a sharp click. There was no greeting. There was no wish for a happy new year. There was only a direct command from a man who believed the universe existed solely to serve his convenience. He genuinely believed it was a technical error. His arrogance prevented him from even considering the possibility that the machine he relied upon had consciously chosen to stop working. The morning crept into the afternoon. The gray sky outside my window offered no sunlight. The temperature continued to drop, and the snow began to fall again in heavy, blinding sheets. My phone remained on the table. It rang every 15 minutes with mechanical precision. I logged the timestamps in my legal pad. Call 12 at 10:45. Call 15 at 11:30. Call 22 at 1:15. I listened to the next batch of voicemails. The irritation in Russell's voice had mutated into genuine anger. The volume of his words was much higher. He was no longer speaking from his bed. I could hear the echo of his footsteps pacing across the hardwood floors of the house I had purchased. Warren, this is not a joke. He had dropped the word dad entirely. The bank customer service line is closed for the holiday, and I cannot get anyone on the phone to override this. You need to answer me right now. I tried to log into the emergency medical account to pull the mortgage funds manually, and the entire portal is locked. It says my access has been permanently revoked due to suspicious activity. What did you do? Turn my access back on right now before I come down there and make you do it. I wrote the words suspicious activity in my notebook. The fraud protocols I had established with the branch manager were functioning perfectly. Russell had attempted to raid the hospice funds to save his own skin, and he had slammed directly into a digital reinforced steel wall. The lifeline was cut. The emergency reserves were sealed. He was trapped on an island of his own making, and the water was rising rapidly. By 3:00 in the afternoon, the missed call count had reached 30. I sat in my small living room, the legal documents neatly stacked in front of me, listening to the utter collapse of my son's reality. The 28th voicemail was chaotic. Tessa was shouting in the background. Her voice was shrill and laced with panic. I could hear her demanding to know why her credit card had been declined at a luxury boutique downtown. The shockwaves were spreading through their entire financial ecosystem. Dad, answer the phone. Russell's voice was trembling now. The aggressive bravado was gone. He sounded breathless, like a man running out of oxygen. Tessa just got embarrassed at the store. The bank locked our joint checking account. They locked the credit line. They locked everything. I do not understand what is happening. Please call me back. We need that money today, or the auto lease is going to default tomorrow morning. Please. I let the recording end. I felt my pulse slow and steady. I felt no satisfaction, only the cold comfort of a mathematical equation balancing itself out. For years, they had treated my resources as an endless, magically replenishing well. They had leased imported vehicles and joined exclusive clubs using money meant to ease a dying woman's pain. They had locked me out in the freezing sleet because my worn jacket offended their corporate friends. They had assumed my silence was a symptom of weakness. They were currently learning that my silence was actually the sound of a predator patiently waiting in the dark. The afternoon faded into a bleak, freezing evening. The shadows stretched across the walls of my apartment. I did not turn on the overhead lights. I sat in the darkness, illuminated only by the faint blue glow of my phone screen. At 6:45, the phone vibrated for the 40th time. I waited for the ringing to stop. I watched the voicemail icon appear. I tapped the screen and pressed play. The voice that came through the small speaker was completely unrecognizable. It was not the voice of the arrogant man who had ordered me off his porch. It was not the voice of the entitled son demanding I fix a technical glitch. It was the sound of a broken, terrified animal. "Dad, please." Russell's voice was thick with tears. He was crying. He was gasping for air between his words. "Please pick up. I am begging you." An automated courier just taped a pre-foreclosure warning to our front door. The bank system automatically flagged the house because the primary escrow has a zero balance and the linked line of credit is currently under federal review for fraud. They said the fraud division is opening an investigation. Tessa is packing a bag. She says she is leaving. "Please, Dad. I have nothing. I cannot access a single dollar. They are going to take the house. Please tell me this is just a mistake. I am sorry about Christmas. I am so sorry. Please call me back." The message abruptly cut off, replaced by the mechanical silence of the application. I placed the phone face down on the table. The stress test was officially concluded. The structure had completely failed. His entire life was built on stolen capital and fraudulent signatures. The moment the bank discovered the forgery on the $45,000 credit line, they had instantly paralyzed his entire financial network. The automated warning taped to his door was just the first tremor of the coming earthquake. He was broke. He was terrified. He was entirely alone. I reached over and picked up the thick manila envelope resting on the table. Inside was the formal 30-day eviction notice legally dissolving his tenancy and ordering him to vacate the property immediately. I traced my finger along the sealed edge of the paper. I knew the 40 missed calls were just the preliminary phase. Desperation would force him out of his house. Desperation would force him to travel through the freezing snow to my apartment. He would not wait for a return call anymore. He would come here to demand his salvation in person. I stood up from the wooden chair and walked to the front door. I checked the lock. I checked the angle of the hidden security camera I had installed above the frame. Everything was in perfect working order. The trap had been baited, and the prey was currently racing blindly toward the steel jaws. I walked back to the kitchen, poured the remaining cold coffee down the drain, and waited in the silent darkness for the heavy knock on my door. It was the evening of January 3rd. The winter storm that had buried the city on New Year's Eve had frozen into a solid sheet of gray ice. I was sitting at my small kitchen table with a glass of tap water. The digital clock on the microwave shifted to 7:14. That was exactly when the heavy, frantic pounding began on my front door. The sound was not a polite knock. It was the desperate hammering of a man who realized his entire survival was collapsing. The thin wood of my apartment door rattled in its frame. I did not rush to answer it. I picked up my phone and opened the security application. The hallway camera displayed Russell and Tessa standing under the flickering fluorescent light. They looked completely unraveled. Russell's expensive wool overcoat was covered in melting snow. Tessa was pacing tightly in small circles, clutching her designer handbag against her chest like a shield. The hammering stopped for a fraction of a second. Russell's voice bled through the cheap drywall. He demanded that I open the door. He shouted that he knew I was inside because my truck was parked in the alley. I took a slow breath. I verified that the hidden camera behind the bookshelf in my living room was actively recording. I stood up, walked across the cold linoleum floor, and unlocked the deadbolt. Russell pushed the door open before I could even pull the handle back. He stepped into my cramped apartment, with all the misplaced authority of a corporate executive barking at a subordinate. Tessa followed closely behind him. They brought the bitter winter cold inside with them. Puddles of melting snow began to drip from their expensive boots onto my cheap flooring. Russell did not offer a greeting. He did not ask how I was doing. He pointed a trembling finger at my chest. He demanded to know why I was ignoring his calls. He shouted that the bank had initiated a hard freeze on every single account. He said the fraud department had locked his digital portal and suspended his debit cards. He told me the luxury car dealership had called him twice that morning, threatening to repossess their vehicles due to the canceled automated draft. I stood perfectly still. I let him expend his volatile energy. I watched his face turn red with panic and outrage. I did not offer him a seat. I did not offer to take their coats. Tessa pushed past her husband. Her carefully cultivated suburban elegance had completely evaporated. Her face was tight with fury. She looked around my drafty one-bedroom apartment with absolute, undisguised disgust. She told me I was a selfish, miserable old man. She screamed that I was intentionally ruining their lives over a petty misunderstanding about a Christmas party. She said her credit card had been publicly declined at an exclusive boutique in front of her senior partners. She called it the most humiliating experience of her entire professional career. She stepped closer to me. She told me I had no right to throw a tantrum and cut off their funding. She insisted the money was rightfully theirs because I had promised to help them get established. She pointed at my faded flannel shirt and told me I obviously did not need the money anyway, since I chose to live like a pathetic pauper in a crumbling building. I listened to her insults with absolute clarity. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my lifestyle. I simply absorbed the final undeniable proof of their predatory nature. They were standing in my home demanding the life savings I had accumulated over 40 years of grueling physical labor, and they were insulting me for the sacrifices I had made to provide for them. Russell grabbed his wife's arm, attempting to pull her back, but his own panic was too severe to maintain control. He looked at me with wild, desperate eyes. He told me to pick up my phone right now. He ordered me to call the bank manager and authorize a manual wire transfer to cover their mortgage default and their overdue car leases. He promised that if I fixed the technical glitch immediately, they would forgive my horrible behavior and allow me to see my grandson next month. It was the ultimate insult. He was attempting to use my love for Leo as a bargaining chip to extort his rent money. I looked at Russell. I saw the exact moment the structural integrity of his arrogance began to crack under the weight of my silence. I turned my back on them. I walked slowly to the small kitchen table. Tessa shrieked that I was ignoring them. She demanded I pick up the phone. I did not reach for my phone. I picked up the thick manila envelope resting in the center of the wooden table. I turned around and walked back to where my son was standing. I extended my hand and offered the envelope to Russell. He snatched it from my fingers with a loud, aggressive sigh. He muttered something about how I should have just written a physical check in the first place instead of causing all this unnecessary dramatic tension. He tore the flap open and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents. I watched his eyes scan the top page. I watched his brain attempt to process the legal terminology drafted by the most ruthless corporate litigator in the city. I saw the exact second his mind comprehended the bold black letters at the top of the page. 30-day notice to vacate premises. Russell stopped breathing. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin the color of dirty snow. He stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. Tessa grabbed his arm. She demanded to know what the paper was. She asked if it was a bank draft. Russell could not speak. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. His hands began to shake violently, causing the heavy parchment paper to rattle in the quiet apartment. I decided to break the silence. I spoke with the calm, measured tone of an engineer delivering a final structural inspection report. I told them I did not co-sign a mortgage 4 years ago. I explained that their abysmal credit scores and massive wedding debts had made them entirely uninsurable to any reputable financial institution. I told them I purchased the 4-bedroom colonial property in cash. I explained that I utilized a blind limited liability company registered in Delaware to acquire the deed. I stated clearly that my corporate entity was the sole legal owner of the house they were currently occupying. Tessa snatched the documents out of Russell's frozen hands. Her eyes darted wildly across the paragraphs of legal statutes and the certified copy of the original property deed. She shook her head in frantic denial. She screamed that it was a lie. She insisted that they were the homeowners. She claimed they had been paying the mortgage for 4 years. I corrected her. I told her they had never paid a single cent toward the house. I reminded her that the $4,200 a month had been coming directly out of my personal retirement portfolio. I explained that they were legally classified as month-to-month tenants. I stated that because I had canceled the automated transfer, their rent was now officially in default. I watched Tessa realize she owned absolutely nothing. The sprawling suburban fortress she used to impress her corporate colleagues was an illusion. The manicured lawns and the neighborhood association were rented fantasies. Russell finally found his voice. It was a weak, trembling whisper. He asked me how I could do this to my own family. He asked how I could make them homeless over a simple misunderstanding. I reached out and tapped the second document in the stack Tessa was holding. It was the itemized financial audit of the emergency medical checking account. It was the account I had opened a decade ago to manage my late wife's hospice care. I told Russell there was no misunderstanding. I explained that I had tracked every single parasitic withdrawal he had executed over the past 2 years. I recited the exact numbers from memory. I told him I knew about the $1,500 a month drained to pay for his exclusive country club memberships. I told him I knew about the auto leasing corporation. I told him I had watched him siphon the money meant for a dying woman to finance his luxury sport utility vehicles. Russell stepped backward. He bumped into the cheap drywall of my apartment. His eyes were wide with pure, unfiltered terror. He realized the audit was absolute. He realized there was no shadow left for him to hide inside. I did not raise my voice. I delivered the final crushing blow with perfect, deadly precision. I told them they had exactly 30 days to pack their belongings and vacate my property. I told them that if they remained in the house on the 31st day, the county sheriff would physically remove them and their possessions would be placed on the curb. I told them the locks would be changed and the property would be listed for sale. Tessa opened her mouth to scream. She took a step toward me, her face contorted with absolute fury. She raised her hand, her manicured nails curling into claws. She was preparing to unleash a torrent of violent abuse. She was preparing to fight for the illusion she had spent 4 years cultivating. I did not flinch. I simply pointed to the hidden camera resting quietly behind the books on the shelf. I informed her that the device was currently recording audio and video in high definition. I told her the feed was broadcasting directly to a secure remote server monitored by my legal team. I suggested she choose her next physical action very carefully. Tessa froze. Her hand hovered in the air. The realization washed over her that she was standing inside a meticulously constructed trap. The arrogant, entitled predators had walked directly into a steel cage and the door had just locked firmly behind them. The kitchen siege was over. The eviction had begun. The silence in the cramped apartment was absolute. Tessa stood frozen with her hand suspended in the cold air. Her eyes were fixed on the small black lens of the security camera, hidden perfectly between my engineering textbooks. She realized her screaming and her physical posturing were being recorded in real time. She slowly lowered her arm and took a step backward, her pristine boots slipping slightly on the melting snow she had tracked onto my linoleum floor. She looked at Russell with a hollow expression of total defeat. The illusion of their superiority had just suffered a catastrophic structural failure. Russell did not share his wife's sudden, paralyzing clarity. Panic is a dangerous element. When a weak material is subjected to immense pressure, it does not bend. It shatters. Russell had spent his entire adult life insulated from the consequences of his actions. Whenever he faced a financial deficit or a personal failure, he simply demanded that someone else absorb the impact. Now he was cornered in a drafty apartment with no access to his stolen funds and an eviction notice bearing his name. The realization that I was the architect of his ruin finally penetrated his arrogance, and the resulting reaction was volatile. He turned away from the manila envelope on the kitchen table and locked his eyes on me. The polished veneer of the successful suburban professional vanished entirely. His shoulders hunched and his jaw clenched. I remembered a time decades ago when a high school counselor had suspended him for failing a crucial examination. Russell had used his physical size to back the much smaller man into a corner, using pure intimidation to force a passing grade. He was a bully who operated under the assumption that volume and proximity could override reality. He began to march across the small kitchen toward me. I did not move. I did not shift my weight or attempt to create distance. I stood with the quiet certainty of a man who knows exactly how much force a steel beam can withstand. Russell stopped just inches from my chest. He was taller than me and heavily built, casting a dark shadow over my face. He leaned down, his breath smelling of stale mints and sour coffee. He lowered his voice into a vicious, trembling growl. He told me to turn off the camera. He ordered me to walk over to the bookshelf, unplug the device, and hand him the memory card. He stated that if I did not destroy the footage immediately, he would make the rest of my miserable life a living nightmare. I looked up into the eyes of the boy I had raised and told him the camera fed directly into a cloud server. I explained that physical destruction of the hardware would not erase the data. The data was already sitting in a secure digital vault monitored by a corporate litigation firm downtown. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He raised his hands and grabbed the thick fabric of my faded flannel coat. He balled the material in his fists and shook me hard, dragging me a step forward. He told me I was nothing but a pathetic, lonely old man. He screamed that I owed him that house and I owed him that money. He said he had endured my boring visits and tolerated my cheap gifts for years just to secure his inheritance. He threatened to drag me into a courtroom and have a judge declare me legally incompetent. He promised he would find a doctor willing to testify that I was suffering from severe dementia. He swore he would lock me in a state-run medical facility and liquidate every single asset attached to my name. He was verbalizing his entire criminal conspiracy directly into the microphone. Every threat, every admission of financial exploitation, and every detail of his plan to strip me of my autonomy was being captured with perfect acoustic clarity. He was handing me the nails for his own coffin. Tessa stepped forward and grabbed his shoulder. She pulled at his jacket, her voice rising in a frantic, high-pitched whine. She told him to stop talking. She begged him to let go of my coat. She pointed wildly at the blinking red light on the camera, fully comprehending the immense legal jeopardy they were standing in. She knew that threatening to falsely imprison a senior citizen in a psychiatric facility while physically assaulting him was an indefensible felony. Russell ignored her. He shoved her hand away and tightened his grip on my collar. He shook me again, demanding that I pick up my phone and call the bank to unlock the emergency medical fund. He told me I was going to wire the $45,000 to his account right now, or he would throw me through the front window of the apartment. I did not struggle against his grip. I slowly reached my right hand into the deep front pocket of my denim trousers. My fingers located the smooth glass of my smartphone. I had anticipated this exact sequence of events. When Grant and I installed the surveillance network earlier that afternoon, we established an emergency protocol. I had programmed a silent panic button on the side of the device. A single prolonged compression of the volume key would instantly transmit a distress signal to Grant's personal line, accompanied by a live audio feed of my location. I pressed the button and held it down. A short, silent vibration confirmed the signal had been successfully dispatched. I looked at Russell. I told him he was making a mathematical error. I explained that applying blunt force to a reinforced structure only guarantees the destruction of the object applying the force. He raised his right fist, pulling his arm back as a primal roar built in the back of his throat. He told me to shut my mouth and give him the money. Before his fist could swing forward, the heavy wooden door of my apartment swung open with a violent crash. It slammed against the drywall, shattering the silence of the hallway. Two uniformed police officers stepped into the narrow entryway. Their hands rested firmly on their utility belts. Their expressions were carved from solid granite. They brought a rush of freezing winter air into the room with them. Behind them stood Grant. He was wearing an immaculate charcoal gray suit, completely unbothered by the blizzard outside. He held a leather folio tucked under his arm and surveyed the scene with the cold, satisfied gaze of a predator observing a successful hunt. The lead police officer pointed a gloved finger directly at Russell. He ordered him to release me immediately and step backward with his hands visible. Russell froze. The primal rage evaporated from his features, replaced instantly by the pale, trembling cowardice of a bully who has finally encountered a superior force. He opened his fists and let go of my flannel coat. He stumbled backward, raising his hands in the air, his eyes darting frantically between the officers and the lawyer standing in my doorway. He tried to speak. He tried to summon the polished corporate tone he used to impress his neighbors at the country club. He stammered that there had been a misunderstanding. He told the officers that this was just a private family dispute and that his father was suffering from a severe cognitive decline. He claimed he was simply trying to calm me down because I was having a terrible episode of confusion. Grant stepped into the apartment. He did not look at Russell. He looked directly at the police officers. He informed them that the entire apartment was wired with high-definition audio and video surveillance. He stated that he had been monitoring the live feed from his office down the street. He told the officers that he had distinctly heard the suspect threaten to throw a 71-year-old man through a glass window in order to extort an unauthorized wire transfer. Tessa began to cry. Real suffocating tears poured down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. She collapsed against the kitchen counter, burying her face in her hands. She knew her professional career, her social standing, and her freedom were entirely ruined. The second police officer pulled a small notepad from his breast pocket. He informed Russell that they had heard the threats of physical violence through the open emergency line before they even breached the hallway. He stated that they were officially documenting a forced entry, trespassing, and the verbal assault of a senior citizen. He asked Russell to produce his identification. Russell reached into his pocket with violently shaking hands. He pulled out his leather wallet and handed his driver's license to the officer. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for salvation. He begged me to tell them it was a joke. He asked me to tell the police that we were just arguing about a football game. He called me Dad for the first time that evening without a trace of anger. He sounded exactly like a terrified little boy. I adjusted the collar of my coat. I smoothed the wrinkled flannel where his fists had grabbed me. I looked at the man standing in front of me and felt absolutely nothing. The foundation was gone. The bridge was gone. There was only empty space remaining. I turned to the police officers. I told them that the man and the woman standing in my kitchen were unwanted trespassers. I stated that I had recently evicted them from a property owned by my corporate entity due to severe financial delinquency. I confirmed that they had come to my home to physically intimidate me into releasing funds they had previously stolen. I requested that a formal incident report be filed immediately to support future litigation. Grant smiled a thin, razor-sharp smile. He told the officers his firm would be securing a permanent restraining order by the following morning based on the documented assault. The lead officer nodded. He turned to Russell and Tessa. He ordered them to step out into the hallway. He told them they were being formally escorted off the premises and that any attempt to contact me or return to the building would result in their immediate arrest for aggravated assault and trespassing. Russell tried to resist. He tried to plant his feet on the linoleum floor. He looked at the manila envelope still resting on the kitchen table, realizing it contained the death warrant for his entire life. The officer stepped forward and placed a heavy hand on Russell's shoulder, physically turning him toward the door. Tessa did not resist. She walked out of the apartment with her head bowed, staring blindly at the wet floorboards. She looked like a ghost walking toward her own grave. I stood in the center of my small kitchen and watched the police officers march my son and his wife down the narrow, dimly lit hallway. The sound of their boots echoing against the walls faded slowly into the winter night. Grant closed the apartment door, shutting out the cold draft. He walked over to the table and tapped the thick manila envelope with his index finger. He looked at me and nodded. The documentation was pristine. The physical threat had been recorded, verified, and officially logged by local law enforcement. Russell had provided the exact legal leverage required to dismantle any defense he might attempt to mount. The trap had not just closed, it had locked. I walked to the sink and filled a glass of cold water. I drank it slowly, feeling the icy liquid travel down my throat. The mask had completely slipped. The true nature of my family had been perfectly illuminated under the harsh light of reality. The physical confrontation was over, but the structural collapse of their world was just beginning to accelerate. I sat back down at the wooden table and picked up my drafting pen. We had a great deal of work left to do. The federal wire fraud charges were next. I opened my legal pad to a fresh page entirely undisturbed by the silence of the empty apartment. The natural order was finally being restored. 2 days passed since the police escorted my son out of my apartment. The silence in my home was profound and uninterrupted. I spent the time organizing the digital files of my financial history. I knew a desperate man would not simply accept defeat and walk away into the freezing winter. When an animal is caught in a snare, it does not contemplate the morality of its situation. It gnaws off its own limb to escape. I was waiting for Russell to chew through the bone. On the morning of January 5th, my phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. It was Grant. He did not bother with pleasantries. He told me to come to his office immediately. He said the opposition had finally made their desperate move, and it was a direct assault on my personal autonomy. I drove through the gray slush of the downtown streets. I entered Grant's office and took my seat. He laid a thick binder on the mahogany desk. He looked at me with a cold, professional intensity. He explained that Russell and Tessa had hired a predatory family law attorney. They had just filed an emergency petition in the county court. They were seeking immediate temporary guardianship over my person and my estate. Grant detailed the contents of the petition. Russell claimed that my sudden financial decisions were the result of aggressive early-onset dementia. He stated that I was suffering from severe paranoia and delusions. He argued that my decision to evict my own family and freeze the medical accounts proved I was no longer capable of rational thought. Russell requested that a judge grant him total control over my physical well-being and absolute authority over my corporate entities to protect me from myself. I listened to the allegations with detached fascination. It was a complete structural inversion. They were attempting to use the very consequences of their theft as evidence of my insanity. Because I stopped them from stealing, they claimed I was mentally unfit. The petition even twisted the events of Christmas Eve. Tessa had written a sworn statement claiming I had wandered onto their porch in the freezing rain, completely disoriented and confused. She claimed I did not know where I was and became violently aggressive when they tried to help me. They took my silent endurance of their cruelty and weaponized it into a psychiatric symptom. I asked Grant how a judge could possibly entertain such a baseless claim without medical proof. Grant slid a single piece of paper across the desk. It was an affidavit of cognitive decline. It was signed by a physician named Dr. Vance. I stared at the signature. I had never met a Dr. Vance in my entire life. My late wife had spent her final weeks under the care of dedicated hospice nurses and oncologists. I had not seen a doctor for anything more than a routine physical in 10 years. I asked Grant how Tessa could possibly find a licensed physician willing to risk his medical credentials for a desperate forgery. Grant explained the social mechanics of their elite circles. Tessa had spent years cultivating relationships at the Oakbridge Country Club, utilizing the stolen hospice funds to buy her way into a network of wealthy influence. Dr. Vance was a fixture at those exclusive events. He ran a boutique wellness clinic that catered to executives who needed discreet prescriptions and questionable medical waivers. He was accustomed to bending the rules for cash. Tessa had leveraged her remaining social capital to convince him that I was genuinely senile and that the paperwork was merely a formality to protect the family estate. He signed the affidavit without ever laying eyes on me, assuming that a poor old man living above a dry cleaner would never possess the resources to challenge a wealthy doctor's medical opinion. It was a fatal miscalculation based entirely on vanity. Grant leaned forward and rested his hands on the desk. He explained the gravity of the situation. This was no longer just a civil dispute over rent or a quiet case of unauthorized bank transfers. Submitting a fabricated medical affidavit to a federal judge to seize control of a senior citizen's assets was perjury. It was a severe felony. They had crossed the threshold from entitled thieves to desperate criminals willing to strip away my fundamental human rights to maintain their luxury lifestyle. If the judge granted the temporary order, Russell would gain instant access to the offshore accounts and the ability to cancel the eviction notice. I asked Grant what our immediate countermeasure should be. Grant told me we could file an immediate motion to dismiss the petition. We could prove the affidavit was a forgery right now and stop the hearing. But Grant did not want to stop the hearing. He wanted them to walk into the courtroom and present the fraudulent document to the judge on the official record. He wanted them to commit perjury in open court. To spring that trap, we needed to build an impenetrable defense. Grant instructed me to leave his office and drive directly to the State Medical University Hospital. He had already arranged an appointment with the head of the neurology department. The doctor was a highly respected specialist who frequently served as an expert witness in complex estate litigation. I was to undergo a comprehensive psychiatric and cognitive evaluation. We needed absolute incontrovertible proof that my mind was completely sound. I left the law firm and drove to the university hospital. I spent 4 hours in a sterile examination room. I approached the exam with the exact same rigorous discipline I applied to calculating the tensile strength of a suspension bridge. I completed every cognitive test they placed in front of me. I solved spatial reasoning puzzles with flawless accuracy. I recited complex numerical sequences from memory. I answered detailed questions about my financial history, my corporate structures, and the specific dates of my long-term investments. My mind is a fortress of logic and mathematics. There are no fractures in my cognitive foundation. The neurologist reviewed my results in silence. He looked at my test scores and then looked at me with profound professional respect. He told me my cognitive function was not just normal for a fool of my age. It was exceptional. He drafted a comprehensive 20-page medical report certifying that I possessed absolute mental clarity and total executive function. He stamped the report with the official seal of the university hospital and signed his name with authoritative heavy ink. I brought the sealed medical report back to Grant's office late in the afternoon. I laid it on the mahogany desk next to the fraudulent affidavit Russell had purchased. The contrast between the two documents was the difference between a solid concrete foundation and a crumbling pillar of sand. Grant smiled his cold, predatory smile. He placed both documents into his heavy leather briefcase. Grant explained the timeline of our demolition. The emergency hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday morning. Russell and Tessa believed they had successfully ambushed me. They believed their expensive lawyer and their purchased medical document would easily convince the judge to strip me of my rights and award them the keys to my entire financial empire. They assumed I was sitting in my small apartment, terrified and confused by the legal assault. They had absolutely no idea that we were perfectly prepared to let them dig their own graves in front of a magistrate. I left the office and drove back to my apartment as the city lights began to cut through the winter darkness. The cold air seeping through the floorboards of my truck felt grounding. I thought about the sheer depravity required to attempt such a maneuver. Russell was willing to lock his own father in a psychiatric facility just to keep his imported cars and his country club membership. He was willing to erase my legal existence to protect his aesthetic. The final remnants of parental grief evaporated from my chest. There was nothing left to mourn because the son I thought I had raised did not exist. He was simply a malicious liability that needed to be permanently liquidated. I walked up the narrow wooden stairs and unlocked my door. I sat at my kitchen table and looked at the blinking red light of my security camera. The game had escalated into a fight for my very survival. They had tried to paint me as a broken, helpless old man. They were about to learn that a master architect never builds a structure without installing a mechanism to tear it down. I drank a glass of water and prepared for the courtroom. The heavy oak doors of the county courthouse were solid and unyielding. I pushed through them with Grant walking in perfect sync beside me. The polished marble floors echoed with the heavy sound of our footsteps. It was a sound I knew well from decades of inspecting municipal buildings. I know exactly how institutions are built. I know how the weight of authority is distributed across a room to intimidate those who do not understand the architecture of power. Today, I was not here to be intimidated. I was here to watch my son attempt to weaponize the legal system and fail catastrophically. We entered the courtroom assigned for emergency hearings. The air inside was stale and thick with nervous energy. Russell and Tessa were already seated at the petitioner's table. They had hired a man named Sterling to represent them. Sterling was a predatory family law attorney who wore expensive suits and possessed a reputation for burying elderly defendants in aggressive paperwork. He was whispering rapidly to Russell as we approached our table. Russell looked up and met my gaze. He offered a smug, patronizing smile. He genuinely believed he was holding the winning hand. He believed the fake medical document he had purchased from his country club doctor was an unbreakable lock. The magistrate entered the room and took her seat at the high bench. She was a stern woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for possessing zero tolerance for frivolous litigation. She opened the file and announced the emergency petition for temporary guardianship. She looked down at me and then over to Russell. She asked Sterling's team to present their justification for attempting to strip a grown man of his fundamental autonomy. Sterling stood up and smoothed the lapels of his suit. He spoke with a practiced theatrical sorrow. He told the magistrate that this was a tragic case of rapid cognitive decline. He claimed I was suffering from aggressive early-onset dementia. He painted a picture of a confused, paranoid father who had suddenly and inexplicably turned against his loving family. He pointed to the frozen bank accounts and the eviction notice as absolute proof of my mental deterioration. He argued that no sane father would throw his own son out into the winter cold. He insisted that I was a danger to myself and required immediate legal intervention to prevent me from destroying my own estate. To seal his argument, Sterling produced the fraudulent affidavit. He submitted the document to the court clerk. He proudly announced that it was signed by Dr. Vance, a prominent local physician. The document certified that I lacked the executive function to manage my finances and required immediate protective custody. Tessa sat beside Russell, dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue. It was a flawless performance of suburban grief. They had constructed a perfect narrative of a young family simply trying to care for a sick old man. The magistrate reviewed the affidavit in silence. The courtroom was completely still. Russell leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. He looked at me with an expression of total triumph. He thought the demolition was complete. He thought he had successfully seized my life savings. The magistrate looked up and turned her attention to Grant. She asked if the respondent had anything to say before she ruled on the emergency motion. Grant stood up slowly. He did not possess the frantic theatrical energy of the opposing counsel. He moved with the calm, deliberate precision of an apex predator closing its jaws. He buttoned his jacket and addressed the magistrate. He stated that we did not intend to argue the emotional merits of the petitioner's claims. He said we were only interested in the structural integrity of their evidence. Grant walked over to the clerk's desk and requested to view the affidavit submitted by Sterling. He looked at the signature and shook his head with mild professional disgust. Grant turned back to the magistrate. He informed the court that I had never been a patient of Dr. Vance. He stated clearly for the official record that I had not seen this physician for a consultation, an examination, or even a passing conversation. Grant asked the magistrate to note the exact date and time stamped on the affidavit. It had been signed exactly 12 hours after I served Russell and Tessa with a formal 30-day eviction notice. Sterling immediately jumped to his feet. He shouted that we were defaming a respected medical professional. He insisted the assessment was valid and conducted through extensive family interviews. Grant ignored the outburst entirely. He reached into his heavy leather briefcase and retrieved a thick bound folder bearing the official seal of the State Medical University Hospital. He approached the bench and handed the folder directly to the magistrate. He explained that we had anticipated this exact desperate maneuver. He told the court that 48 hours ago I underwent a comprehensive, grueling cognitive and psychiatric evaluation. He stated that the evaluation was not conducted by a boutique wellness doctor looking for a quick paycheck from a country club friend. It was administered by the head of the neurology department at the state's leading research hospital. The magistrate opened the folder. The silence in the room deepened until it felt heavy enough to crush the breath out of my son's lungs. I watched the magistrate read the detailed 20-page report. The report certified my perfect spatial reasoning. It certified my flawless memory recall. It certified my absolute unyielding mental clarity. The neurologist had explicitly concluded that I possessed total executive function and operated at a cognitive level exceptional for a man of any age. The color drained completely from Russell's face. His smug smile fractured and collapsed. Tessa stopped dabbing her eyes with the tissue and stared at the thick medical report resting on the judge's desk. They realized instantly that their cheap forgery was completely eclipsed by an unassailable mountain of legitimate scientific evidence. The magistrate lowered the file and looked directly at Sterling. Her eyes were hard and unforgiving. She asked the attorney to explain how his client secured a diagnosis of severe dementia from a doctor who had never physically examined the patient, while the leading neurologist in the state had simultaneously certified the patient as perfectly healthy. Sterling stuttered. The smooth, arrogant cadence of his voice completely vanished. He looked at Russell for an explanation, but Russell was staring blankly at the floor. Sterling attempted to backpedal. He stammered that his clients had acted in good faith based on the behavioral changes they had witnessed. He tried to claim the eviction notice had caused genuine concern for my well-being. The magistrate cut him off sharply. Her voice echoed through the marble courtroom. She stated that the petition was not an act of family concern. She declared it a transparent and malicious attempt to retaliate against a lawful eviction. She noted the highly suspicious timing of the medical claim, pointing out that the sudden concern for my mental health only materialized the moment their free housing and stolen money were revoked. She looked down at Russell and Tessa. She told them she found their actions deeply disturbing. She stated that attempting to weaponize the guardianship system to bypass a legal eviction was a severe abuse of the judicial process. She informed them that submitting an unverified medical document to seize control of an individual's assets bordered on criminal fraud. The magistrate announced that the emergency petition for guardianship was dismissed with prejudice. She explicitly ordered that no further petitions of this nature could be filed without a court-appointed independent medical examiner. She then looked directly at Sterling and suggested he advise his clients to prepare for the severe legal consequences of filing a fraudulent affidavit under oath. The hearing was over. The counter-strike had been perfectly executed. We had not just defended the fortress. We had demolished their siege engines and scattered their forces. Grant packed his briefcase with slow, methodical movements. Sterling did not linger. He packed his papers frantically and walked rapidly out of the courtroom, leaving his clients sitting alone at the table. He knew his reputation had just been severely compromised by their lies, and he wanted to distance himself from the coming fallout. I stood up and buttoned my coat. I looked across the room at my son. Russell was shaking. His hands gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were white. He was breathing in short, shallow gasps. The reality of his absolute defeat was finally suffocating him. He had played his final card. He had tried to erase my legal existence, and he had failed publicly and disastrously. Tessa did not look at me. She stared straight ahead, her face rigid with shock. The country club connections had failed her. Her arrogant assumptions about my intelligence had ruined her. They had just over 3 weeks left in the house and absolutely no access to the funds required to secure a new one. I walked past their table without saying a single word. There was nothing left to discuss. The emotional bond had been severed long ago, and the legal bond was now officially dissolved. I pushed through the heavy oak doors and stepped back out into the freezing winter morning. The air was sharp and clean. Grant walked beside me, his predatory instincts fully satisfied by the total victory in the courtroom. We walked toward the parking lot in silence. The second phase of the demolition was complete. The house was secured. My autonomy was absolute. But the foundational crimes still remained unpunished. The $1,500 stolen every month from a dying woman's medical fund. The $45,000 fraudulent credit line forged to build a luxury patio. The civil matters were settled, but the criminal liabilities were ripe for harvesting. I unlocked my truck and climbed inside. I looked at Grant standing on the frozen pavement. I told him it was time to move to the final phase. It was time to hand the forged signature and the audio recordings of their violent threats directly to the federal authorities. Grant nodded in agreement. The mask had slipped, the trap had snapped shut, and now the crushing weight of the law was about to fall directly onto my son's shoulders. I turned the ignition and drove away from the courthouse, leaving the ruins of Russell's arrogance completely behind me. The victory in the family court was merely a structural clearing. We had removed the debris of their false medical claims, but the foundational theft remained unresolved. The $45,000 fraudulent credit line was a loaded weapon sitting on the table. Russell had forged my signature to secure those funds. Grant and I sat in his corner office watching the snow fall against the glass. I told him I did not want a quiet settlement. I wanted the federal authorities to dismantle my son completely. Grant poured a glass of water and outlined the final maneuver. We needed Russell to commit a federal crime on camera in front of witnesses. Grant drafted a settlement offer. It was a masterpiece of legal bait. The document stated that I would halt the eviction process and legally forgive the stolen hospice funds if Russell signed a sworn admission. The admission required him to acknowledge that he had opened the $45,000 credit line without my consent and agree to a strict repayment plan. Grant emailed the proposal to Sterling. Sterling immediately forwarded the document to his client and formally withdrew as their legal counsel. The family court disaster had spooked him. Russell was now completely isolated without legal protection. I sat in my apartment watching the security feed from my hidden cameras. I knew Russell could never sign that admission. A sworn acknowledgement of unauthorized credit extension was a written confession to wire fraud. But he also knew that refusing the settlement meant he would be physically thrown out of his house in 20 days. His back was pressed firmly against a concrete wall. He had no money to hire a new attorney. Desperation is a powerful catalyst for catastrophic mistakes. 2 days passed in silence. On the morning of January 8th, my phone vibrated. It was a direct message from Russell. He told me he was ready to settle the entire dispute. He requested a meeting at Grant's office that afternoon. He stated he had a counter-proposal that would resolve the financial issues without requiring him to admit to any criminal liability. I called Grant and told him to activate every recording device in the firm. The prey was walking directly into the facility. I arrived at the law firm an hour early. Grant and I tested the audio feeds and verified the cloud storage connection. The cameras were completely invisible, hidden inside the smoke detectors and behind the thick bindings of the legal encyclopedia on the bookshelf. Every word spoken in that room would become permanent federal evidence. At precisely 3 o'clock, the heavy glass doors of the lobby opened. Russell walked in wearing a wrinkled suit. His usual arrogant posture was entirely gone, replaced by a nervous, sweating energy. He was not alone. Walking beside him was a thin man carrying a worn leather briefcase. The man wore a cheap gray suit and avoided making eye contact with the receptionist. I knew instantly that this man was not a lawyer. A legitimate attorney enters a room with a defined presence. This man moved like a rat scurrying along the baseboards. Grant led them into the corner office and closed the door. The soundproofing absorbed the noise of the city traffic outside, leaving the room completely silent. I sat across the mahogany desk and looked at my son. His eyes were bloodshot. He smelled faintly of stale alcohol and cheap cologne. He did not look at me. He stared directly at Grant and stated that he rejected our settlement offer. Grant leaned back in his leather chair and asked Russell how he intended to stop the eviction and resolve the $45,000 fraud investigation without signing the agreement. Russell smirked. It was a weak, trembling imitation of his former arrogance. He told Grant there was no fraud investigation because there was no fraud. He stated that I had voluntarily granted him absolute financial authority over all my accounts a year ago. He claimed he had the legal documentation to prove it. He turned to the thin man sitting next to him. Russell introduced the man as Marcus. He claimed Marcus was an independent notary public and a private financial auditor. Marcus opened his worn leather briefcase and placed a single sheet of heavy paper on Grant's desk. He slid the document across the polished wood. I looked down at the paper. It was a general power of attorney. The document explicitly granted Russell total control over my banking profiles, my credit lines, and my corporate assets. The text stated that I authorized him to execute loans and manage my estate due to my declining health. The date at the top of the page was stamped exactly 14 months ago. At the bottom of the page was my signature. It was the exact same sloppy, erratic forgery I had seen on the bank loan application. The loops were too wide, and the pressure was completely inconsistent. Next to the forged signature was a blue notary stamp bearing Marcus's name, confirming that he had personally witnessed me sign the document 14 months ago. The audacity of the move was breathtaking. Russell had realized he could not beat the forgery charge, so he decided to double down. He had hired a black market document forger to create a retroactive legal shield. He believed this fake power of attorney would retroactively validate the stolen credit line and force me to drop the eviction. Grant picked up the document and examined it with absolute professional detachment. He looked at Marcus. Grant asked Marcus directly if he was a licensed notary in the state. Marcus swallowed hard and nodded. He stated that his license was valid. Grant asked him to confirm for the record that he was physically present in the room 14 months ago and personally witnessed me sign the power of attorney. Marcus looked at Russell. Russell gave him a sharp, desperate nod. Marcus turned back to Grant and stated clearly that he had personally verified my identification and watched me sign the paper on that exact date. The air in the room grew instantly cold. The trap had just snapped completely shut. Grant placed the forged document gently back onto the desk. He laced his fingers together and looked at Marcus. He asked Marcus if he was aware of the federal penalties for forging a legal instrument used to conceal bank fraud. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He stammered that he was just a notary and the document was completely legitimate. I leaned forward and spoke for the first time since they entered the room. I told Marcus that 14 months ago I was standing on a steel scaffolding in a neighboring state supervising the emergency reinforcement of a commercial bridge. I explained that I was surrounded by 40 union steelworkers and a team of county inspectors for 14 consecutive hours on the exact date printed on his fraudulent document. I told him I had the payroll records, hotel receipts, and government inspection logs to prove my exact geographic location. The blood drained entirely from Marcus's face. He looked down at his cheap shoes and then looked at the door. He realized he had just walked into a fatal ambush. Grant did not give them a single second to recover. He pointed a finger at Marcus and outlined the exact reality of the situation. He told the forger that producing a fabricated legal document to extort a settlement and cover up a federal banking crime was a severe felony. He stated that conspiracy to commit wire fraud carried a minimum mandatory sentence in a federal penitentiary. Grant then looked at the ceiling and addressed the hidden microphones. He stated for the record that the entire conversation had just been recorded in high-definition audio and video. He informed them that the footage was currently sitting on a secure server accessible only by the federal authorities. Russell shot out of his chair. The wood scraped loudly against the floor. He lunged toward the desk, reaching for the forged power of attorney. He was acting on pure blind panic, trying to destroy the physical evidence of his crime. I stood up instantly. I grabbed his wrist before his fingers could touch the paper. My hands had spent 40 years gripping steel cables and twisting heavy iron bolts. I crushed his wrist with a vice grip, locking his arm completely in place. Russell gasped in pain and dropped to his knees. He looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. I looked down at the son who had locked me out in the freezing rain. I looked at the man who had stolen money meant to comfort his dying mother. I told him the game was permanently over. I told him there were no more fake documents to buy and no more doctors to bribe. He had just committed a federal crime inside a law firm while completely surrounded by surveillance cameras. Marcus did not wait for permission to leave. The forger scrambled out of his chair, abandoned his leather briefcase on the floor, and bolted through the heavy glass doors of the office. He ran down the hallway, desperate to escape the blast radius of my son's catastrophic failure. Grant did not stop him. The briefcase on the floor contained all of Marcus's forging equipment and notary logs. The authorities would find him within hours. I released Russell's wrist. He fell backward onto the carpet, clutching his arm against his chest. He began to hyperventilate. The immaculate suburban facade had finally burned away entirely, leaving nothing but a desperate criminal sitting on the floor of a law firm. He begged me to delete the footage. He promised he would pack his bags and leave the house tonight. He swore he would never contact me again if I just let him walk away. I walked around the desk and picked up the forged document. I folded it neatly and placed it inside my coat pocket. I looked down at the broken man crying on the carpet. I told him I was not going to delete anything. I explained that an architect does not halt a demolition simply because the building asks for mercy. The structure was corrupt from the foundation up, and the explosive charges had already been detonated. Grant picked up his office phone and dialed a direct number. He asked for the federal prosecutor assigned to financial crimes. The civil dispute had officially ended, and the criminal prosecution had begun. I walked out of the corner office, leaving my son sobbing on the floor as the weight of the federal government began to descend upon him. The extraction was complete. The disease had been entirely excised from my life. I stepped out into the frozen city streets, feeling the cold air fill my lungs. The sky was clear, and the horizon was perfectly unobstructed. The drive away from the courthouse and the law firm felt remarkably different from the journey there. The crisp winter air seeped through the vents of my truck, but it no longer felt bitter or biting. It felt cleansing. The structure of my son's deception had been entirely hollowed out. There was no foundation left to support his arrogance. Grant had made the call to the federal prosecutor, but the truth of the situation was far more intricate than a simple phone call. We did not just stumble into a lucky break with the notary. The man named Marcus was never a genuine threat to my autonomy. He was a demolition charge planted by the authorities long before Russell ever brought him into Grant's office. Grant had known exactly who Marcus was the moment he laid the forged document on the mahogany desk. The federal authorities had been tracking a sophisticated document fraud ring operating in the city for over 8 months. Marcus had been caught forging commercial real estate deeds earlier in the year. Facing decades in a federal penitentiary, he had agreed to become an active informant. He wore a concealed recording device to every meeting. He documented every illicit transaction. When Russell desperately sought out a black market professional to fabricate my medical records and power of attorney, he unknowingly hired a man actively working for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The details of Marcus and his cooperation with the federal government were a masterpiece of legal engineering. When Russell first went searching for a forger, he reached out to a shady contractor he had previously used for unpermitted remodeling work. That contractor handed him a prepaid phone number. Russell thought he was being incredibly stealthy. He thought he was operating in the deep shadows of the criminal underworld. In reality, he was dialing directly into a federal switchboard. Marcus was instructed by his handlers to agree to every single request Russell made. When Russell asked for a backdated power of attorney, Marcus happily obliged. When Tessa demanded a fake psychiatric evaluation bearing the signature of a compromised doctor, Marcus provided the document with a smile. The federal agents instructed Marcus to let the arrogance of my son dictate the pace of the operation. They knew that entitled people rarely recognize danger because they believe the rules simply do not apply to them. The $50,000 Russell transferred to Marcus to secure these fake documents was the ultimate nail in his coffin. He did not use cash. He used the fraudulent $45,000 credit line he had opened in my name utilizing digital banking applications to move the funds across state lines. That single action activated the federal wire fraud statutes. It transformed a local case of elder abuse into a major federal prosecution involving the digital transmission of stolen funds. The federal agents tracked the digital footprint of the money as it moved from the bank server directly into the evidence accounts controlled by the Bureau. It was a flawless chain of custody. Every panicked phone call Russell made to coordinate the forgery had been captured. Every demand Tessa made to expedite the fake psychiatric evaluation had been logged and transcribed by federal agents. They had essentially filmed their own documentary of their criminal conspiracy. The meeting in Grant's office was simply the final piece of corroborating evidence the prosecutor required to execute the warrants. The hammer fell 48 hours later. It was a bitterly cold Thursday morning. The suburban neighborhood where Russell and Tessa lived was quiet and pristine. The manicured lawns were hidden beneath a perfect blanket of white snow. The residents of the gated community were drinking their expensive coffee and preparing for their comfortable corporate jobs. That pristine illusion was shattered precisely at 6 in the morning. I did not need to be there to see it. Grant provided me with the complete details later that afternoon. 3 dark sport utility vehicles pulled into the wide, circular driveway of the colonial house. A dozen federal agents wearing heavy tactical vests stepped out onto the frozen pavement. They did not knock politely. They did not wait for Tessa to put on her designer clothes. They breached the heavy oak front door with a steel ram. The sound echoed through the entire wealthy subdivision, waking the neighbors and triggering dozens of security alarms. Russell was pulled from his bed. The man who had spent 4 years treating me like a disposable asset was forced to stand in his grand foyer, wearing only his sleepwear. His hands were secured behind his back with heavy steel cuffs. Tessa was escorted down the sweeping staircase by 2 female agents. Her carefully crafted image of suburban superiority was completely destroyed. She was weeping hysterically as the agents read them the list of charges. The neighbors stood on their porches and watched through their windows as the golden couple of the neighborhood was marched out into the freezing cold. The charges read by the federal agents were extensive and absolutely devastating. Conspiracy to commit medical document fraud, aggravated identity theft, federal wire fraud, attempted extortion. The $50,000 they had paid the informant escalated the charges to a level that guaranteed a lengthy mandatory sentence. They were loaded into the back of the federal vehicles and driven away from the property they had tried so ruthlessly to steal. The agents did not just arrest my son and his wife. They executed a total asset seizure. The imported luxury vehicles parked in the garage were impounded. The expensive furniture and artwork inside the house were cataloged and frozen by the authorities as the proceeds of financial crimes. The house itself remained untouched only because my corporate entity held the pristine legal deed. Every single thing Russell and Tessa claimed to own was stripped away in a matter of hours. The parasitic growth had been entirely excised from the host. By noon, the local news networks had broadcast the details of the raid. The story of a prominent suburban couple conspiring to declare an elderly father mentally incompetent to steal his life savings was too sensational to ignore. Tessa lost her position at the corporate firm before the sun went down. Her partners immediately severed all ties to avoid the toxic public relations fallout. Russell was banned from the Oakbridge Country Club the moment his mugshot appeared on the television screens in their private lounge. The social ecosystem they had sacrificed everything to conquer rejected them instantly and permanently. I sat in my small apartment above the dry cleaner and watched the news report on my small television screen. I watched the helicopter footage of the federal vehicles parked in the driveway of the house I had purchased. I watched the reporters stand in the snow and detail the exact mechanics of the fraud. I felt no pity. Pity is an emotion reserved for those who suffer a tragedy by chance. This was not a tragedy. This was a mathematical certainty. You cannot build a heavy structure on a foundation of rotting wood and act surprised when it collapses. Grant called me later that evening. He informed me that bail had been denied. The federal magistrate deemed Russell and Tessa a severe flight risk given their proven willingness to forge legal documents and steal massive sums of money. They would remain in federal custody until their trial. Grant told me their assigned public defenders had already reached out hoping to negotiate a plea deal. They were desperate to minimize the prison time. Grant advised me that the prosecutor had no intention of offering leniency. The evidence was too absolute, and the crime was too repulsive. I thought about the sheer vanity required to execute such a flawed plan. Russell and Tessa had spent their entire adult lives relying on my silent financial support to maintain their illusion of grandeur. They were so accustomed to my quiet compliance that they completely forgot I was an engineer. They forgot that I spent 4 decades designing structures that could withstand hurricanes and earthquakes. They attempted to outmaneuver me using cheap paper and sloppy lies. They brought a sledgehammer to demolish a titanium vault. Now they were facing the terrifying machinery of the federal justice system. The prosecutors would systematically dismantle every aspect of their lives. The luxury cars, the country club memberships, the designer clothes, and the elite social status were all gone forever. They would spend the next decade in federal prison reflecting on the exact moment they decided to lock an old man out in the freezing rain. The controlled demolition was completely finished. The dust had settled and the site was entirely cleared. The son who had locked me out in the freezing rain to protect his aesthetic was now locked inside a concrete cell. The woman who had insulted my worn clothes was wearing a standard-issue prison uniform. The money they had siphoned from my late wife's hospice fund would be painfully extracted from them through years of federal restitution. I turned off the television and walked into my quiet kitchen. I poured a glass of cold water and looked out the window at the dark city. The winter storm had finally passed. The sky was clear, and the stars were brightly visible above the skyline. The structural integrity of my life was fully restored. The blueprints were clean. The foundation was solid steel. I drank the water and enjoyed the absolute unbroken silence. The wheels of federal justice grind slow, but the mechanisms of corporate finance move with absolute terrifying speed. The moment the federal agents froze the offshore accounts and seized the physical assets, the bank initiated immediate foreclosure proceedings on the suburban house. Russell had not made a legitimate mortgage payment in 6 months. He had been relying entirely on the fraudulent credit lines and the money he siphoned from my accounts to maintain the illusion of ownership. When Grant delivered the verified evidence of wire fraud to the loan officers, the bank immediately voided the remaining grace periods. The eviction notice was no longer a personal family dispute. It was a binding mandate from a major financial institution. The bank executives saw the federal indictments pending against my son and realized their collateral was at severe risk. They moved to reclaim the property with ruthless corporate efficiency. The morning of the eviction was brutally cold. The sky was a solid sheet of gray steel reflecting the absolute finality of the day. The winter frost clung to the manicured lawns of the subdivision like a heavy, suffocating blanket. I parked my truck halfway down the street from the towering colonial house. The neighborhood was wide awake. The wealthy residents of the gated community were standing on their porches and watching from their bay windows. The suburban ecosystem demands perfection and brutally expels anyone who breaks the illusion of success. Russell and Tessa were no longer the golden couple of the neighborhood. They were a contagious disease, and the community had gathered to watch the quarantine process unfold. People who had gladly attended their lavish dinner parties now stood with their arms crossed, whispering quietly to one another. The social currency Tessa had purchased with my stolen money was completely worthless. Two heavy white vans from the county sheriff department pulled into the wide circular driveway. 4 deputies stepped out onto the frozen concrete. They did not move with anger or malice. They moved with the cold, bureaucratic efficiency of men who perform evictions every single day of the week. They walked up to the heavy oak front door and pounded on the wood. The heavy sound echoed down the quiet street, cutting through the freezing wind. The bank had officially taken possession of the property. Every piece of expensive furniture, every designer garment, and every luxury appliance inside that house was now frozen collateral attached to the federal fraud investigation. Russell and Tessa were only allowed to leave with the clothes they were wearing and whatever personal items could fit inside a single standard cardboard box. The life they had built on a foundation of theft was being boxed up and categorized by the state. The front door opened, and the deputies stepped inside the grand foyer. 20 minutes passed in complete tense silence. The neighbors pulled their expensive coats tighter against the freezing wind, refusing to look away from the spectacle. Finally, Tessa emerged from the house. She looked completely unrecognizable. The arrogant, polished woman who had mocked my faded flannel coat and demanded my absolute compliance was gone entirely. She was wearing plain gray sweatpants and a heavy winter jacket. Her face was pale and entirely devoid of the expensive makeup she used as a shield. She carried a small brown box clutched tightly against her chest. She walked down the long brick path with her head bowed, staring blankly at the frozen ground. She did not look at the deputies standing on the porch. She did not look at the neighbors judging her from their lawns. She looked like a hollow ghost wandering aimlessly through the ruins of her own shattered life. Russell followed her a few moments later. A tall deputy walked closely behind him, ensuring he did not stop or attempt to re-enter the property. Russell carried nothing at all. His hands were empty and shoved deep into his coat pockets. He wore an old dark jacket and heavy work boots. His posture was completely broken. The broad, intimidating shoulders that he used to bully his way through life were hunched severely forward. The heavy pressure of federal indictments, the loss of his career, and the total public disgrace had crushed his spine. He stumbled slightly on the bottom step of the porch. The deputy did not reach out to help him. The officer simply pointed a gloved finger toward the street, instructing him to leave the premises immediately and permanently. I stood on the sidewalk beside the frozen trunk of an old elm tree. My hands were resting quietly in the pockets of my coat. I did not move as they walked slowly down the long driveway. I simply watched the structural collapse reach its absolute final conclusion. Russell lifted his head and saw me standing there in the cold. His bloodshot eyes locked onto my face. He stopped walking. The deputy behind him told him to keep moving, but Russell planted his boots on the concrete. He stared at me with an expression of pure, agonizing clarity. He realized in that exact moment that this was not a stroke of bad luck or a temporary setback. He understood that every single terrible thing happening to him was the direct mathematical result of his own horrific actions. He had tried to steal the foundation from beneath my feet, and he had successfully demolished his own world in the process. He took a hesitant step toward me. He opened his mouth to speak. I do not know what he intended to say. I do not know if he wanted to beg for a place to sleep, or if he wanted to scream his final resentments into the winter air. It did not matter. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I did not offer a single word of condemnation or anger. I looked at the boy I had raised. The man who had gladly planned to lock me in a psychiatric ward for a few $1,000s, and I offered him absolutely nothing. The silence between us was an impenetrable wall of solid steel. I am an engineer. I know exactly how much weight a load-bearing beam can support before it fractures under the stress. I had supported the heavy weight of his entitlement and his cruelty for decades. I had absorbed the financial blows and the emotional neglect, hoping that a solid foundation could eventually stabilize a warped structure. But the beam had finally snapped. There was no connection left to repair. A bridge that has fallen into the river cannot simply be wished back into the sky. It must be cleared away so the water can flow freely again. Russell read the absolute finality in my eyes. The last pathetic spark of defiance died completely within him. He closed his mouth and lowered his head. He turned away from me and walked slowly down the street, following his weeping wife into the biting wind. They had no vehicles left to drive. They had no money hidden away in secret accounts. They had no friends left in the prestigious country club who would dare answer their desperate phone calls. They were walking toward a public bus stop on the outer edge of the subdivision, beginning a long, terrifying journey into the unforgiving federal justice system. I turned my attention back to the property. The deputies had finished their rigorous sweep of the interior rooms. A representative from the bank walked up the driveway carrying a heavy metal lockbox and a thick steel chain. He secured the grand front doors and attached the lockbox to the polished brass handle. He hammered a bright yellow foreclosure notice into the frozen earth right beside the brick mailbox. The legal warning fluttered violently in the cold wind. The house was no longer a symbol of stolen wealth or suburban superiority. It was simply an empty dark shell waiting to be liquidated by the bank to pay off their massive fraudulent debts. The neighbors began to disperse, returning quickly to the warmth of their secure and legitimate homes. The spectacle was officially over. The subdivision had successfully purged the financial infection from its streets. I stood on the sidewalk for a few moments longer, listening to the wind rattle the bare branches of the tall elm trees. The natural order had been entirely restored. The parasites had been cleanly removed, and the host had survived the extraction. I walked back to my truck and climbed inside the cold cabin. I started the engine and turned the heater on high, letting the warm air slowly thaw my frozen fingers. I thought about the detailed legal files sitting on Grant's mahogany desk. I thought about the federal prosecutors actively preparing the extensive wire fraud and conspiracy indictments. The criminal machinery would continue to grind forward without requiring my direct involvement. My quiet, necessary work in the shadows was officially complete. But I put the truck in gear and drove slowly out of the gated community. I did not look in the rearview mirror as I turned the corner. I left the towering colonial house and the yellow foreclosure sign completely behind me. I drove back toward the city, toward my small, quiet apartment above the dry cleaner. My home was modest and cramped, but it was built on a foundation of absolute truth and honest labor. I had protected my legacy and reclaimed my personal honor. I watched the gray city skyline emerge through the windshield, completely satisfied by the beautiful, unyielding mathematics of justice. The state criminal courthouse was built from heavy blocks of gray limestone. It was designed to resemble a fortress of absolute accountability. I walked up the wide concrete steps with Grant walking at my side. The winter wind had finally subsided, leaving the morning air completely still and bitterly cold. I have spent my entire life evaluating the integrity of massive structures. I know that a building designed to administer justice must feel immovably heavy. It must impress upon the guilty that they cannot manipulate the walls that confine them. Russell and Tessa had spent their lives manipulating every environment they entered. Today, they were walking into a structure they could not control. We took our seats in the front row of the gallery directly behind the prosecutor's table. The courtroom was lined with dark wood and sterile fluorescent lighting. A heavy wooden door on the side of the room opened, and 2 county bailiffs escorted my son and his wife into the space. I looked at the people who had tried to erase my legal existence. They were stripped of all their purchased armor. Russell wore a loose orange custody uniform that completely swallowed his frame. His broad shoulders were rounded and defeated. He shuffled his feet across the linoleum floor, staring blankly at the polished wooden table of the defense. Tessa walked close behind him. The woman who had once stood in my cramped kitchen and mocked my faded clothes was now wearing the exact same cheap orange fabric as her husband. Her hair was pulled back tightly, and her face was entirely drained of color. The elite country club socialite had been reduced to a simple state inmate. They sat down at the defense table in complete silence. They did not turn around to look at the gallery. They did not search the room for allies because they knew they had none left. The friends they had bought with my stolen money had abandoned them the moment the federal indictments became public knowledge. The judge entered the room and took his position at the high bench. He was a veteran jurist with a reputation for merciless efficiency. The trial was scheduled to be swift. There was no need for a lengthy theatrical display because the evidence was absolutely irrefutable. The lead prosecutor stood and addressed the court. She did not raise her voice or attempt to manufacture false emotion. She simply laid out the chronological architecture of their crimes. She explained how Russell and Tessa had drained a dying woman's medical fund to finance their luxury lifestyle. She detailed the $45,000 fraudulent credit line used to build a patio. The defense attorney attempted to interrupt. He tried to introduce a narrative of financial desperation. He claimed his clients were simply overwhelmed by the rising costs of suburban living and made poor, impulsive choices under severe duress. The prosecutor immediately dismantled that defense. She stated that desperation does not explain premeditated conspiracy. She produced the banking records showing the exact moment Russell transferred $50,000 of stolen funds to a known federal informant. She explained that this money was used to purchase a fabricated psychiatric evaluation and a forged power of attorney. The prosecutor pointed directly at Russell and stated that these were not impulsive choices, but calculated steps designed to imprison a perfectly sane man. The prosecution then played the audio recordings captured by the hidden cameras in Grant's office. The voices of my son and his wife filled the silent courtroom. The judge listened as Russell confidently presented the forged documents. He listened as Tessa demanded that the eviction be halted in exchange for my physical freedom. The malice in their voices was amplified by the sterile acoustics of the room. It was one thing to read a transcript of a crime. It was entirely different to hear the raw, unvarnished arrogance of two people attempting to destroy a family member for financial gain. The defense attorney lowered his head and stopped taking notes. He knew the structural integrity of his case had completely collapsed under the sheer weight of the audio evidence. The prosecutor called me to the witness stand. I walked past the defense table without looking at Russell or Tessa. I took my seat and swore to tell the truth. The prosecutor asked me to describe the events of Christmas Eve. I sat in the wooden chair and spoke with absolute mechanical precision. I recounted how I stood on their porch in the freezing rain. I explained how my son looked me in the eye and locked the heavy front door to protect his holiday party from the embarrassment of my presence. I told the court how they later attempted to use that exact moment of cruelty as fake medical evidence of my dementia. I remembered a summer afternoon many decades ago when Russell was a young boy. I had taken him to a construction site to show him how to pour a concrete foundation. I told him that day that a single critical error in the base of a structure would eventually bring the entire building down. I told him that gravity never forgives a lie. He had not listened to me then, and he had spent his entire adult life trying to defy that simple rule. I looked at the judge and stated that my son had built his entire existence on a foundation of theft and manipulation. I explained that I did not take any pleasure in his destruction, but I refused to allow him to use my life as the raw material for his survival. The defense attorney declined to cross-examine me. There were no inconsistencies to exploit in my testimony. I was dismissed from the stand, and I returned to my seat next to Grant. The trial moved rapidly toward its inevitable conclusion. The prosecution rested their case and the defense offered no witnesses. They had nothing left to present. The fraudulent medical documents, the forged power of attorney, and the recorded extortion attempts formed an inescapable steel cage around the defendants. The judge did not require a lengthy deliberation. He looked down at the documents spread across his bench and then fixed his gaze entirely on Russell and Tessa. The courtroom was so quiet, I could hear the faint hum of the heating vents. The judge stated that in his 30 years on the bench, he had rarely seen a case of elder abuse so thoroughly documented and so aggressively malicious. He addressed Tessa first. He told her that exploiting the medical funds of a dying woman to finance a country club lifestyle was an act of profound moral depravity. He then turned his attention to Russell. He told my son that attempting to imprison his own father in a psychiatric facility using forged documents was a crime that defied basic human decency. He stated that the legal system relies on the assumption of truth, and attempting to corrupt that system with fabricated medical records is a direct assault on the court itself. The judge announced that he found them both guilty on all counts of conspiracy wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. The sentencing was immediate and merciless. The judge sentenced Tessa to 7 years in the state penitentiary. He then sentenced Russell to 12 years in state prison. He ordered them to pay full restitution for every dollar they had stolen, including the medical funds and the fraudulent credit lines. He mandated that their remaining liquidated assets be transferred directly to my corporate entity to satisfy the debts. The heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block with a sharp, violent crack. The sound signaled the absolute end of their privileged existence. The bailiffs stepped forward and instructed Russell and Tessa to stand. Tessa began to weep silently as the heavy steel cuffs were placed around her wrists. She was led away through the side door without looking back. Russell stood up slowly. His face was entirely hollow. He looked at me one final time across the sterile room. There was no arrogance left in his posture. There was no anger. There was only the empty realization that he was about to spend the next decade of his life locked inside a concrete cell. He was escorted out of the courtroom, and the heavy door clicked shut behind him. Grant closed his legal briefcase and nodded to me. The operation was completely finished. The diseased components had been entirely removed from the structural framework of my life. I stood up and walked out of the courtroom. The heavy limestone walls of the building felt appropriate. Justice is simply a matter of correct engineering. When you apply the right amount of pressure to a corrupt element, it eventually shatters and leaves the honest material standing intact. I walked down the wide concrete steps and stepped out into the bright winter afternoon. The gray clouds had completely cleared, leaving a pristine blue sky stretching over the city skyline. The freezing air felt incredibly clean in my lungs. I walked toward my truck, parked on the street. I did not feel any lingering sorrow. I felt the quiet, profound satisfaction of a man who has successfully restored the natural order. I unlocked the door and started the engine. The path forward was completely clear, and the foundation was finally secure. The winter eventually broke, yielding to the slow, deliberate thaw of early spring. I have always appreciated the transition of the seasons because it mirrors the necessary phases of a construction project. Winter is the time for pouring concrete, allowing the cold to cure the foundation into an unbreakable slab. Spring is the time for erecting the steel frame. My life had just endured a brutal winter of demolition and excavation. The diseased structure of my family had been torn down to the bedrock. Now it was time to build something entirely new upon the cleared earth. The first required action was the total liquidation of the suburban house. The bank had executed their foreclosure on Russell's fraudulent debts, but my corporate entity retained the master deed. Grant and his team of attorneys worked with methodical precision to disentangle the property from the federal criminal investigation. The process required weeks of filing heavy legal paperwork and negotiating with aggressive bank executives who desperately wanted to recoup their losses. Grant applied the exact pressure required using the federal indictments against my son as leverage to expedite the clearance. Once the federal prosecutors officially released the physical asset, I instructed Grant to list the house on the open market immediately. I did not want to retain ownership of a structure that had housed so much deceit. A building absorbs the energy of its occupants, and that house was completely saturated with vanity and entitlement. I drove to the property one final time before the real estate brokers arrived. The neighborhood was quiet, and the manicured lawns were beginning to turn a vibrant green under the morning sun. I parked my truck in the empty circular driveway and unlocked the heavy oak front door. The interior was completely barren. The federal authorities and the bank liquidators had stripped away every piece of expensive furniture, every imported rug, and every crystal fixture that Tessa had purchased with my stolen money. The grand foyer echoed with my footsteps. The house was reduced to its absolute basic geometry: wood, drywall, glass, and steel. I walked through the empty rooms, inspecting the load-bearing walls and the structural supports. Without the superficial layers of luxury, the house was simply a functional sequence of angles and corridors. I stood in the center of the vast living room, where Tessa had once screamed at me, and Russell had once threatened to lock me in a psychiatric ward. There were no ghosts lingering in the corners. There was only empty space and the smell of fresh paint applied by the bank contractors. I felt a profound sense of closure. The physical space had been cleansed of their infection. I locked the front door for the absolute last time and handed the keys to the broker waiting on the sidewalk. The house sold within 14 days. The real estate market in that exclusive gated community was highly competitive, and the property was acquired by a young physician and his wife. They paid in cash. Grant finalized the transaction and wired the total proceeds directly into my primary offshore accounts. I sat at the small wooden table in my apartment and watched the digital numbers multiply on my computer screen. The transaction was mathematically perfect. The final connection to my past life was officially severed and monetized. I did not experience any surge of greed when the funds were deposited. I am not a man who measures his worth by the balance of a bank ledger. To me, money is simply a structural material. It is the steel rebar that reinforces the concrete of personal autonomy. For decades, I had allowed my son to siphon that material away, weakening my own foundation to support his towering delusions. I had compromised my own security to build a life for a boy who ultimately viewed me as nothing more than a disposable resource. That financial vulnerability was now permanently eradicated. The massive influx of capital from the sale of the house guaranteed that I would never again be placed in a position of dependence. I had total, absolute control over my medical care, my living arrangements, and my daily existence. There would be no more anxious calculations about affording basic necessities while my son drove imported cars. There would be no more silent sacrifices made in the shadows of his arrogance. The money sat in a heavily encrypted digital vault, serving as an impenetrable wall between me and the rest of the world. It generated a quiet, passive income that funded my simple needs with absolute certainty. I decided to remain in my small apartment above the dry cleaner. Grant had suggested I purchase a comfortable condominium in a secure luxury building, but I declined. I have never required vast amounts of space to feel comfortable. A master architect knows that efficiency is always superior to excess. My apartment was compact and strictly functional. The floorboards were old, and the windows rattled when the wind blew through the downtown streets, but it was entirely mine. No one ever knocked on my door demanding money. No one ever entered my kitchen to criticize my faded flannel shirts or complain about the smell of my coffee. My daily routine became a masterpiece of unbroken silence. I woke up at 5 in the morning and brewed a single cup of dark coffee. I sat by the window and watched the city slowly illuminate as the sun rose over the industrial district. I spent my mornings drafting new architectural blueprints simply for the intellectual challenge. I designed complex suspension bridges and intricate high-rise support structures on my drafting table, letting the pure logic of mathematics occupy my mind. There were no emotional variables to calculate. There were no unpredictable human elements to ruin the equations. I found immense beauty in the rigid laws of physics. In the afternoons, I walked to the local public library or sat in the quiet corner of a neighborhood diner. I observed the people around me with a detached, peaceful curiosity. I saw families arguing over trivial matters and parents exhausted by the demands of their ungrateful children. I watched them labor under the heavy, invisible chains of biological obligation. I had worn those exact same chains for 45 years. I knew how the metal cut into the skin and how the weight slowly deformed the spine. Observing them now, I felt an overwhelming sense of lightness. The chains had been shattered, and I was completely free. Society places a heavy, irrational emphasis on the concept of bloodline. People are conditioned to believe that sharing genetic material automatically guarantees loyalty, respect, and unconditional love. It is a deeply flawed premise. Biology is merely a starting point. It is the raw, unrefined material. Character is built through actions, choices, and consistent integrity. Russell possessed my genetic material, but he possessed none of my character. He was a defective product of his own vanity and his own unchecked greed. I no longer thought of him as my son. I thought of him as a failed experiment. The 12-year sentence he was serving in the state penitentiary was not a tragedy to be mourned. It was the correct mathematical output of the variables he had entered into the equation. He had tried to bypass the required labor of life by stealing the results. The universe inevitably corrects those errors. Tessa was serving her 7 years in a separate facility, stripped of her country club status and her superficial pride. They were exactly where they belonged, entirely contained by a system designed to punish extreme structural failure. I did not feel lonely in my isolation. Loneliness is the painful gap between the connection you expect and the connection you receive. I no longer expected any connection. I had accepted the absolute truth of my existence. I was a solitary structure standing independently against the elements. I did not require external validation or familial warmth to sustain my integrity. I found profound comfort in the predictability of my days and the absolute silence of my evenings. Every choice I made was dictated solely by my own preferences. The natural order of my universe was fully restored. For years, the equilibrium had been violently tilted by the parasitic demands of my ungrateful bloodline. The scale had finally been balanced. I had utilized the cold, unyielding machinery of the law to crush a rebellion fueled by pure arrogance. I had not resorted to shouting or physical violence. I had simply stepped out of the way and allowed the heavy consequences of their own actions to crush them completely. I walked to the sink and washed my coffee cup, drying it with slow, deliberate motions. The apartment was perfectly still. The security cameras I had installed months ago were still active, but their blinking red lights no longer represented a defensive perimeter against a looming threat. They were simply quiet observers of my peaceful routine. The war was definitively over. The final blueprint was drawn without a single error. I sat back down at my wooden drafting table and picked up my pen. I was an old man living a quiet, invisible life, and I had never been stronger. The profound lesson embedded in this journey is the realization that biological ties do not mandate eternal sacrifice. Unconditional love should never become a vehicle for unchecked exploitation. When family members view your generosity as a weakness to be mined rather than a gift to be cherished, the natural equilibrium is destroyed. Preserving your own dignity and financial autonomy is not an act of selfishness, but a necessary structural reinforcement of your life. True peace arrives the moment you stop attempting to stabilize a corrupt foundation and instead allow the heavy consequences of reality to correct the imbalance. Please share your thoughts in the comments on whether you have ever successfully severed toxic family ties.